to Crime in Court. This is the rewatch of the 1993 Menendez brothers trial. Erik and Lyle Menendez on trial for the homicides of Kitty and Jose, their parents. And we are on part three, which is the second to the last part of closing arguments, and then we'll be done. But like I said, we'll have some more, like some things to wrap up at the end. But um, for now, we are on part three of closing arguments. We've had two sets of attorneys throughout the entire trial, two separate juries. So the arguments we're going to hear today are in front of the Erik jury only, and Erik only is in the room. Lyle is not. And when it was Lyle's closing arguments, Erik was not in the room. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but I noticed that. All right, so this is before we get to the video, I do have a couple quick announcements regarding their resentencing and whatnot. So here I have a couple quick articles I want to go over. So uh, here is an article from CNN, and it's titled "Incoming Los Angeles County District Attorney Could Ask to Delay Menendez Brothers Resentencing." And now this is so obviously you guys should know we just had an election and District Attorney Gascon was not reelected and someone else took his place or will be taking his place in December. So let's learn a little bit about that. So Nathan Hochman, who defeated incumbent George Gascon in Tuesday's election to become the next Los Angeles County District Attorney, told CNN that he could ask to delay a hearing to have Erik and Lyle Menendez resentenced nearly 30 years after their convictions for taking their parents' lives. Before I can make any decision about the Menendez brothers' case, I will need to become thoroughly familiar with the relevant facts and the evidence and the law, Hochman said in a statement. I will have to review the confidential prison files for each brother, the transcripts from both trials, and speak to the prosecutors, law enforcement, defense counsel, and the victims' families. So he's got a lot of things he needs to do. Read through all the transcripts and discuss with others about their case. So the statement concludes, if for some reason I need additional time, I will ask the court for that. Hochman is expected to take office December 2nd, and the hearing to determine the request made by his predecessor is currently scheduled for December 11th, giving Hochman just 9 days to review the case from inside his office. I doubt he's going to have time to do that, so I'm thinking this is probably going to be delayed, unless they can maybe acclimate him to the case before he takes office, which, there's always that transition period. So maybe they can get him started ahead of time, but I don't know if they do that. So, anyways, if he doesn't get started until December 2nd, it would give him only 9 days to review the case. And that's just not enough time, especially with a trial that lasted like a year or something like that. It took a long time. So he's not going to read through all the transcripts in that time. In an interview with CNN, Hochman said that he would move as expeditiously as possible to review the case. If I ask for a delay, it won't be a delay for delay's sake because I think the Menendez brothers, the victims, the family members, the public deserve to have a decision done as soon as it can be done in a thorough manner. As we know, Gascon made the request last month to resentence Erik and Lyle from life in prison without parole to the life in prison with parole for the 1989 crime. Under California law, the brothers now are immediately eligible for parole because the law is if you're incarcerated under the age of 26 now, um, you should not be given life without parole. That's the law because of knowledge and studies that we have now. People can rehabilitate. And then there's this other article, or I'm just going to show you like bits and pieces of the article because it's about the brothers' clemency here. So the brothers' defense team, Mark Garagos and Cliff Gardner, submitted a clemency request on October 28th. So we know attorney Gascon also submitted a bid for clemency from Governor Newsom, and Mark Garagos and this other attorney, Cliff, are also submitting a request for clemency. Newsom will now review the case with the brothers' potential release immediately in his hands. Clemency offers their quickest path to freedom. If Governor Newsom grants clemency, it could mean a reduced sentence or a release for the Menendez brothers before their set court date on December 11th. So everybody cross your fingers that Governor Newsom releases them before December 11th, and then we don't have to deal with this DA, this new DA, and who knows what he's going to do. So cross your fingers. However, the defense attorneys are also pursuing two additional paths, seeking Judge Michael Jessick's review of the sentencing recommended by Gascon and seeking Judge William Ryan's review of their habeas corpus petition, which is asking for a new trial based on new evidence or resentencing or whatever. And it says they don't want to get their hopes up only to have them dashed, as they've witnessed many fellow inmates experience this, according to Rand, Rob Rand, who extensively reports on this. He says they've seen others who believe they might be getting out, marking off dates on a calendar only to find that they don't. Both Erik and Lyle have said, "We're just waiting to see what happens." That's kind of sad. Like every little ounce of hope in prison that you have gets pretty much trampled. Another thing I wanted to point out here, which they didn't give us a screenshot of it, this is Free the Menendez brothers on X. In the Newsweek article that she's posted here, it says that the Green Space Project. So remember, we talked about this Green Space Project where they're beautifying the grounds in the prison grounds, and they're painting murals and things like that. Well, the brothers have said that if they do get released, they want to come back to the prison. They want permission to come back to the prison and continue their projects. They want to see their project through. They want to make it final. They still want to help the prisoners. Like how can you not let these guys go? They're just awesome. Awesome people. So anyways, I think that they've been through hell already, and for them to still want to help others is just amazing. So, all right, we'll leave it at that. That's pretty much the updates that I wanted to give you guys regarding the Menendez brothers. So let's get started. Let me swap over here. Oops, let me shrink down. All right, so back to the trial. We are on part 3, closing arguments. Defense is speaking. Leslie Abramson is speaking for the defense. And again, it's only Erik in the room, no Lyle, only the Erik jury. And then we will hear from Mr. Kuriyama again, but not until part 4. So we're just going to continue on with Leslie Abramson and let her give it a go. I took it back a few seconds just so we didn't miss anything. She's talking about the transcript from Bob Anderson.
Was changed at the last minute, and therefore when Erik tells you he finds this out Friday night and it frightens him, he's telling you the truth. So here they are on the boat trip where they're thinking something's going to happen, and he's describing the family. He said, what did you observe about the interaction of this family? Did they seem to be happy and getting along? How did they appear? He says they were very actually apart during the trip. The sons were up front. Jose was either in the stern of the boat or down below with Kitty. There wasn't very much interaction going on, verbal interaction going on. Now that's their first witness to talk about this family. And then, of course, you heard the testimony, let's skip that, of Perry Berman. And he talks about how Jose would behave when he was training Erik and how upset and embarrassed Erik was when Jose jumped in there and said, make him work harder, this kid who never worked. And it was his opinion, knowing this family, this is Mr. Berman, and this is asked on cross-examination, that if there were any problems or secrets in this family, they would keep it to themselves. And he also said that this was a home where there was tension, that Jose ran his home like a company, and he was chairman of the board, and that he wanted control in every aspect of his sons' lives. Now, maybe this is all a given to you now, but this is how the picture of these parents emerged, bit by bit, through every witness who knew them. I don't think it's new.
It is.
See, I was right.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll resume at 1:30.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's after lunchtime, which for some of us is usually sleepy time, so there's always a temptation in the afternoon to talk twice as fast. You can get all the same stuff done in half the time. That makes Lynn's life misery. And the idea is that you're supposed to hear what I say whether you want to or not. So I will try to finish this afternoon. For my own personal reasons as well as for your benefit, I would like to do nothing tonight for the first time in 5 months. Nothing at all. Okay, what I propose to do now is just to briefly point
Okay, 5 months. The trial was 5 months then, she just said. She has been busy for 5 months straight.
out some aspects of the testimony of some of the defense witnesses that I think are particularly significant, and it's going to be just small references to each one, but that I think are significant in getting the total picture of what was going on inside the family. And here is an excerpt, if you will, from Alan Anderson's testimony. He said when the boys were disciplined with a belt, he was told to stay in front of the TV set. Neither he nor Kitty would go down the hall to the room, and Kitty would turn up the volume of the TV. And in spite of that, Alan could still hear the sound of the belt. Now, I tell you this as I'm going to point to other places where Mrs. Menendez doesn't just not interfere, but she is an aider and abetter in the behaviors of Jose Menendez. And at the end of the trial, you're going to be given an instruction in aiding and abetting. The theory being that since Erik didn't kill anybody, he aided and abetted his brother Lyle in killing. And you will see what it takes to be an aider and abetter in crimes. So that apart from the specific things that Mrs. Menendez did to make herself individually fearsome, the fact that she was joined at the hip to Jose Menendez in his behavior towards the children was very apparent from an early age. And she, too, can be evaluated as an aider and abetter. And that was one of the earlier acts that a cousin saw.
That's a great point. I'm glad she brought that out because you don't even think about that. But yeah, she's helping Jose commit the crimes. So she is not innocent. For anybody who wants to think that she's innocent, she has maltreated the boys horrifically all on her own, but she also helps Jose do it, or at least aids and abets. She turns a blind eye to it and allows it to happen. So she's letting it happen. She's helping him get away with these crimes.
Alan also testified that when his personal reaction, he was about 15 when he was with the family, when Mrs. Menendez would have one of her uncontrollable rages and would be in these rages saying that her problem was the children, including Alan. Alan found this extremely frightening, and he thought that Erik was particularly affected by it because Erik was as young as he was. Well, I'm going to skip that. Alan also described that one of the expectations in the family was that the boys have a high tolerance level for pain. Now, you may remember, but if you don't, I'm going to remind you soon, that Erik testified that there was a time that came in the progress of the molestation by his father, when his father told him he had to make him immune to pain. And what seemed to trigger that particular idea was that Erik had been with his father at a doctor's office, and he had received a shot, and he screamed. And his father was so humiliated that his son would scream that he wouldn't let Erik leave the doctor's office through the front waiting room, even though the screaming was already over. They had to sneak out the back because no son of Jose Menendez would scream in pain. And so what Jose then did was he instituted this pain training, which involved tacks that I demonstrated for you yesterday. But of course he isn't pain training. That's just a sadist's excuse in order to blame the victim. Now, you brought this on yourself because you don't know how to deal with pain. You're a sissy, and I'm going to teach you how to deal with pain. And a very similar thing was said to Erik when he was screaming after he was raped by his father. It was his fault because, after all, Jose had warned him the time before, don't scream again or I'll go all the way. But Erik forgot that part and screamed, and he went all the way. And after that, Jose said to him, if you ever cry out again, I will tie you to a chair and beat you till you die. And remember, if I do that, whose fault will it be? And Erik had to answer, since he knew the drills, my fault. Right, said his father. The significant thing about Alan's testimony and Diane's testimony is that they saw a dramatic change in Erik's personality and behavior before 6 versus after 6. They both talked about Erik being outgoing and happier and cheerful before 1977. And then Alan says in 1977 he noticed that Erik was extremely introverted. And a major behavioral and personality change in a child, as we heard and as I think we all sort of knew, is a strong indication that a very severe form of abuse is going on, and particularly corroborative of sexual abuse. See how much I'm passing? And even at the very early times that Alan Anderson is with this family, he says, across the board, without hesitation, neither Kitty nor Jose showed any affection whatsoever towards their children. And that is a theme that you hear over and over and over again. Now, maybe, not everybody has to be demonstrative, but there are other ways to convey the message of love. Only that's never conveyed in this family. And when children don't feel loved, it makes them miserable and it makes them fearful. And when a parent doesn't love you, it is more likely that they will hurt you. And those are the messages that are being conveyed to Erik. Another theme of Jose Menendez is that Erik testified to, that's corroborated by his cousins, is that there would be all this competition between the boys that Jose would encourage. And Erik was always the loser, and he was always told by Jose, how come you can't be more like Lyle? And Erik testified that during the time that he cried during some of the sexual episodes, he was chided and derided for being a wimp and a sissy and a baby, and why couldn't he be more like Lyle? Lyle, if you recall, the testimony about him was a stoic little boy who wouldn't cry, because emotion in that family, according to everybody, was not rewarded. You were considered weak and inferior if you showed emotion, and Lyle got the message to simply go limp and to bow his head and to take whatever Jose had to give him without tears. And the last time anybody testified they ever saw Lyle cry was when he was 4 years old, and Jose said something to him so frightening the child was incontinent, as Peter Cano described it, and he was then dragged down the hallway for having made in his pants, and Peter Cano came into the room and thought that Jose was being particularly brutal, and at this point Lyle was crying, and Jose punched Lyle in the stomach. And that was the last time anybody ever testified that they saw Lyle cry. But Erik was a different child. He could not stop crying.
She helps paint the picture, doesn't she? She's good at words.
You recall that Erik testified that things between his mother became even worse when she decided to be his tutor and his trainer in schoolwork. And that change was witnessed by Diane Vandermolen, who testified to that effect. And I've already talked about how Diane knew about these meetings between Jose and Erik in his room, and how Erik would then not be coming to dinner. But the other thing she said was very interesting. You don't remember, but Dr. Burgess testified that what child molesters do is they try to make the behavior seem normal to the child. They tell them this is what goes on between fathers and sons. In this particular case, what Erik testified to is that his father would say this is what goes on with the Romans and the Roman and Greek soldiers. And he was a big history buff, particularly about Rome. We talk about their family as being descendants from the Romans. And Diane Vandermolen remembers that what would happen is after sports or after Jose would come home, Jose and his two sons would go off and take showers together. And after the showers, they would sit on the floor, and Jose would teach them about history for hours. So he sort of made the molestation part of the history lesson to make it seem normal to the children. Because remember, this happened to Lyle also, and he was told the same thing. Now, Diane is also the person who testified that Lyle made a complaint to her about his molestation, and she was attacked by the prosecution for that because she hadn't revealed that the very first time she was interviewed by the defense. And the prosecution tried to make it seem that she only came up with that story because she visited Lyle in the county jail 3 times in 1991. The problem with that assertion, apart from everything you've now heard, you probably know more about visiting at the county jail without having been there than anybody else. But besides the fact that there's no privacy and everything is on a phone and you only get a very few minutes and there's other people around, is the fact that Diane did not, after these visits, get on the phone, call Jill Lansing up and tell her the story. It was 7 months after she had been in Los Angeles that she was re-interviewed and revealed that memory. So there doesn't seem to be any linkage there with these crowded visits to the county jail and her recollection of that episode. In fact, what she had said about it was Kitty was so rejecting and in such denial about it that for the longest time Diane thought she didn't remember it right. And it's only when she really thought about it that she said, wait a minute, I put that aside for years, maybe it means something. Now we have the testimony of Mr. Wadlington, who was the coach who got a little emotional on the witness stand. He felt, and he was probably right, that he was the only person who ever loved these boys when they were little, and certainly the only person who ever communicated it to them. I think the family loved them too, but were kept farther away. But what did he say about this spoiled brat, if you will? The boys had no free time. They even practiced on Christmas every day. They had to play if they were sick. They had to play if it was raining. They had to play if they were hurt. And that was the kind of training camp regimen that these boys were raised under. He said that he never saw either parent affectionate, praising, supportive, or kind. And he is the one who spent much more time with Mrs. Menendez than Mr. You also heard the testimony of a young woman, Meredith Krugman Geisler. She was the lifeguard at the country club. And she observed this very unusual behavior by the Menendez parents on behalf of Mrs. Menendez. She was the only mother she knew who didn't work full-time, who just dropped her kids off at the club, rain or shine, and abandoned them. And it would rain, and there would be storms, and she wouldn't come and get them for hours at a time. And she described Erik as an extremely lonely and shy and sad little boy. With respect to Jose Menendez, what she observed was the way he would humiliate Erik in front of his peers, in front of other competitors. And she also saw that the children never were critical of the parents, never talked back. Now remember, they're not 18 here, they're just little kids, and they're obedient little kids. And she said she never saw Kitty comfort or congratulate Erik. She never saw any support from her towards Erik at all. Their cousin Marianne Cano testified about the summer of 1986 when she stayed with them in the Princeton house. She too was seeing a family in which there's no kindness, in which there's no affection. But she saw something very interesting. She saw Erik at a tennis tournament where only Kitty was there, not Jose. And Erik was not playing well. And she says Kitty was getting very uptight and upset. She kept clenching her fists. She would say, I can't believe he's losing this match. I can't believe he's losing. He should never be beat by this guy. And that Kitty was talking in a loud, upset tone of voice. That after the match, Erik was devastated. Kitty did not comfort him. They went right to the car, and the entire ride home, there was total silence. And then when Jose got home that night, Kitty explained every wrong thing that Erik did. But Karen Farrell comes into this courtroom and wants you to believe that losing or winning didn't make any difference to Kitty. It was all the same. She loved her boys. Later on that evening, Jose Menendez is playing Jeopardy at Erik's expense, humiliating him and ridiculing him for having lost a 10. This isn't one of the big ones, you know. This is right there in New Jersey. This isn't Kalamazoo. But he's humiliating the kid endlessly at dinner. And later on, Marianne's prevented from going to Erik to console him because this is such an outrageous thing that she's seen at dinner. Later on, she gets to sneak down to the basement to see her cousin, to tell him that she commiserates. And what does he say to her? Does he complain about his father? Does he criticize him? He says, oh, don't worry, I'm used to it. Marianne's mother, Martha Connor, testified in front of the blue jury, the Erik jury, several times. And she told you that she saw these same patterns of behavior, where how badly Erik treated and how he took it over all the years. But one thing that she testified to that no one else was able to tell you except Erik was that Jose Menendez referred to Erik. He said this about him. He called Erik a sissy. He said, it's about time he became a Menendez. He was not worth his last name. He should be ashamed of his average, mediocre performance. And Erik testified that his recollection was that the worst thing in the world to be called in that family was average or mediocre, and the greatest punishment was to be told you weren't going to be a Menendez. Jose Menendez also described Erik as too soft, too tender, and too mediocre. Mrs. Cano also observed after swim matches, Jose telling Erik, come on, Erik, I'm going to give you a massage so you can warm up. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are the sexual massages going on by the pool, but this was the normal behavior that preceded the sexual massages that made them seem like just a continuation of normal behavior that Erik testified to and that Dr. Burgess said was so typical of how child molesters gain access to their victims. You make it seem like it's just some normal behavior, and this is part of that. The other thing that Mrs. Connor testified to that was significant with respect to corroborating what Erik's testimony is that the couple of times, remember these are kids who are kept away from other adults, but the couple of times when Erik was permitted over all those years to stay over at her house because of his extremely close friendship with Andy, Erik would always lock Andy's door. Now, this is something Mrs. Connor didn't like because Andy didn't do that. But not only did Erik always lock Andy's door, she heard Erik say to Andy how lucky Andy was to have a door that could lock. And you may recall that Erik testified that the door to his bedroom did not lock. And when Jose was inside his bedroom performing sexual activities with Erik, the way he would make sure that nobody would stumble into that bedroom is he would take a slat from underneath the bed and prop it up under the door handle. Now, what reason would a 12, 13-year-old boy have to want to have his bedroom door locked? I'm not going to get into any of Mrs. Connor's financial testimony. I think that issue is pretty much resolved. I just want to turn attention briefly to Faith Goldsmith's testimony. She was Kitty Menendez's best friend. I've already talked about her reaction to Kitty's plan to leave Lyle. But there's something about Jose and Mary Louise Menendez's attitudes about children that in some respects is so unusual that you have to think about it as a little bit crazy. I mean, I realize that I'm talking to you about a man who I believe is a sadistic sexual abuser of his children and a woman who knows this and lets it happen. And maybe you think that's crazy, but there's something even crazier. And it has to do with their conviction that they are so perfect that they can only have perfect kids. Faith Goldsmith remembers in Jose and Kitty talking about their children, wanting them to be number one in sports, wanted them to be good in school so they could make the right contacts, wanted them to make the right contacts to be successful in business. And she remembers asking Jose, what would you do if they, the boys, were not the best? What would you do if one of them had a learning disability? And Jose's reaction was, that can't happen. Not kids. His child could never have a learning disability. He'd never have a child like that. That wasn't even a possibility. Now, that's a little bit of crazy thinking, but it persists because later on we hear the testimony of Sandra Sharp, who was a Spanish teacher at PDS, and she testifies that Jose Menendez says to her, thinks about, he's Cuban, Lyle's Cuban, Lyle should learn Spanish in 2 weeks because it's in the blood, or it's in the genes. And he says a very similar thing to Mrs. Sharp about Erik. There's no reason why Erik can't speak Spanish. We're Cuban. I don't want to have the same problem we had with Lyle. And that's crazy thinking. There's something very nuts there in these strange ideas about his power of his gene pool. Mrs. Sharp also described Erik, as many teachers did, as very fragile, needy, vulnerable, sensitive, caring, and below average. But of course, no one in the family knew he was below average because Mrs. Menendez would brag that he was a straight A student right in front of him so that he knew, I don't measure up. My mother has to lie about me. She lies to everybody and tells them these false stories because the truth about me just isn't good enough. A couple of things that Mrs. Baralt testified to that I haven't touched on yet that I think are significant. She said very clearly these children as children never had any time to play. Every single minute of their day was accounted for and was always intensely scheduled and structured. I'm just trying to overcome this basic big lie about Erik, that somehow, as a rich kid, he had an easy life. You've never heard one bit of evidence about it, but that didn't stop Mr. Kurian from getting up here and proposing that to you. And every single person knows that his life was really toil. And then we have from Mrs. Baralt this remarkable story that is just unusual, and we tell it because every unusual glimpse into this family reinforces the notion that something's very wrong here. This photograph here is a picture of Lyle, about 4.5 or 5, standing in front of the steps of the Hinsdale house. And the house across the street, which is here, and across the lot, and over there, is Aunt Terry and Uncle Carlos's house in Chicago. And you heard the story about how Erik as a baby would go out and cross that street. And the significance of that story is threefold, I guess. Number one, it shows you how little Kitty Menendez cares about the health and welfare of her children. Number two, it tells you that that's really a cold environment if a baby will go out in the cold to get a cracker and a smile. And number three, it tells you about how duplicitous Mrs. Menendez is, because you may remember Terry Baralta, she calls her every morning and says, Eric's here. Oh, no, he's not. He's in his room. Well, whose baby do I have here, said Terry. And then Kitty would come across the street and be angry at Erik for having left the house. So he's a year and a half old, 2 years old at this time. And you can't read too much into it. I mean, one person that I consulted with on this case early on said, why is the baby running away from home? And I said, well, I don't know if the baby's running away from home. He's looking for some warm spot. And this is a house that is definitely not emotionally warm. Or he's looking for a cracker and the parents have the bedroom door locked, so he's not going to get fed there. But you'd think that a mom, knowing she's got a baby crossing a public street in the morning, you'd think she would make it a point to get up a little earlier because the baby needs something and to give it to him so he doesn't have to keep leaving the house 15 to 20 times. If you were at all a caring mother, this kid wouldn't have gotten out after, say, the second time. We put out a number of teachers to talk to you about what Erik was like when they knew him and what kind of personality he displayed. And the obvious things that kept emerging were that they noticed the learning disabilities. They apparently were never adequately treated. You know that he went to the Lewis School for an evaluation, and Mrs. Menendez would not let the evaluation take place. That even the preliminary evaluation showed all these things, dysnomia, dysgraphia, all these disses, which meant that he had deficiencies in all these areas. And you have never heard, because it didn't happen, that he ever got any remedial help for any of this stuff. And that would be okay, I suppose, if they weren't putting pressure on him to be the best. When you know you've got a kid who's disabled, if you accept them, if you want what they are capable of doing from them, fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And even if you don't want to advertise the fact, but to know that this is wrong with him and to continue with this insanity about perfection and superiority and that your kids have to be number one and the best, it's just to torture them. Okay. We also have called Ed Fenner to be a witness. He sort of is a jokey young man. But he lived in this household, and one of the things that I called him to testify to, which I think is significant, is this. He lived at that house for several months. He was there. He started out in Calabasas house in September. He moved with them to Beverly Hills. He went home briefly for Christmas. He was back again until he went on the professional tennis circuit and went to Israel, which was exactly what Erik winds up doing the next year, and is in Israel, for example, when Lyle gets arrested. But in any event, he goes there, and then he comes back to the house again in March. So he's living with them, with the exception of the 3 weeks on the tour and 2 weeks he goes home for Christmas, fairly continuously from September through March. And what does he say? Everybody locks their doors. Both the parents and Erik lock their bedroom doors in that house, which is contrary to a theory the prosecution has that based.
So weird. Why would the parents lock their bedroom? Keep their kids out. I mean, it's your kids. You got to take care of them. I don't understand. Like, just let them cross the street and the Baralt family will handle them. But then be angry at him when he leaves. Makes no sense.
Based on Oziel, that only the parents were locking their doors and only the last week. He talks about all these arguments between Kitty and Lyle every morning right next to the maid's room. And the maid came in here and told you this was Ozzie and Harriet in Beverly Hills and nobody ever made any noise and nobody yelled at everybody and everybody was happy. Okay, fine. But the fact is that there are lots of arguments and lots of screaming and yelling going on there, and the maid doesn't hear it, and if she does hear it, she isn't going to talk about it because she's a nice little lady who doesn't snoop into the affairs of the people she works for. In any event, he talks about these things happening, and he sees this behavior on the part of Mrs. Menendez where she goes after Lyle and is very angry every day. The other thing he talks about, though, is this. I asked him, did you know, he plays tennis with Lyle, he showers with Lyle, he hangs out with Lyle, he spends all this time with Lyle. Did you know Lyle was wearing a hairpiece? No. Was it ever discussed around the house? Never. Did Erik ever mention it? No. Now, he gets very close to Erik because after Lyle goes back to school in January, Erik asks permission of his parents to allow Ed Fenner to stay, and they become good friends. Now, the prosecution would have you believe that Erik, for no reason, out of the blue, in a conversation that was preceded by nothing and followed by nothing, would say to Jamie Pisarcik on that warm spring day in January, oh, I know my brother has a hairpiece. Sure. But not a word of it is ever mentioned about around Ed Fenno, who's living in that house all that time. And I'll get back to Ms. Pisarcik later. But that's what Ed Fenno knew, and he also knew that Jose spent time alone in Erik's bedroom and would shoo Ed out of the room when he was going in there, and moreover, that he never heard any sounds coming from any other part of the house. The house seemed very quiet to him. Barbara Howarth was a teacher of Erik's in the 9th grade, and I thought what was most significant about what she said about the kind of fearfulness and anxiety that Erik demonstrated was this. She said, Erik saw everything as potential danger. He was particularly anxious, very different than other 9th grade boys. He had very low self-confidence. Now, I want to talk to you about the molestation evidence in this case, the thing that the prosecution most wants to avoid. And all I'm going to talk to you about are the certain aspects of it that it was testified to by Dr. Burgess, told her, who has examined thousands of sexually abused children, that Erik was telling her the truth. And that was the point in calling Dr. Burgess, so that with her experience and her immersion in this field and her familiarity with all the research studies and her familiarity with all the literature, she could tell you that I'm pretty experienced. I know enough to know a fake story from a real story, and this one's real. And that was the point of calling her. Because Mr. Kuriyama will get up here and tell you, didn't happen. Well, because he says so, it didn't happen. Where's his expert to come in here and say, I too am familiar with the literature and the research. He too could hire an expert who could go down to the county jail and spend 50 hours with Erik, and then let that person come in here and tell you this story doesn't fit the pattern, this story isn't believable, there are things in this story that sound like it's made up. But they did not bring in an expert to do that. They did not refute any of the expert testimony in this case, but he's going to have the nerve. He is going to, trust me, he's going to have the nerve to get up here and say, ignore it. It didn't happen. He's a liar. Why should we call experts? Experts are worthless. They're hired guns. They were paid to testify. He's paid a fortune to be here every day. I'm paid. Everybody in this room is paid. We work. Those people work. And they try to make it look like they were just waiting around for this case to come along so they could make $100 an hour. $100 an hour is not a lot for a nationally recognized expert in any field. You can get a plumber for a little less, but that's about it. And yet they try to make it seem like these people are corrupt. These people have national reputations. They're on television. You think they're going to come here and say something ludicrous? Something that they can't support based on all of the research and all of the literature? Yeah, we spent a fortune to bring these people in front of you. Do you think I'm going to put on someone accused of first-degree murder in his own trial to talk about something so extreme if I can't back it up with expert opinion? No way. Because if there was an expert opinion, then they'd be getting up here and saying, oh, he just made it up. We're the experts to tell us this is real. Well, you saw them to tell you it was real. And all three of them, Dr. Burgess, Dr. Tyler, Dr. Vickery, told you it was real. And some of the ways that they analyze it's real because, Dr. Vickery, for example, talks to killers. He's a forensic psychiatrist. He's not a touchy-feely, doctor for little abused kids. He's not a bleeding heart. He deals with the court system, and the people that he interviews are people who are on trial for their lives. They're people who have killed other people. He's been involved in lots of sex abuse cases, so he's talked to a lot of sex offenders. He's not some bleeding heart. And he is skeptical, and he knows how to interview, and he knows how to look for lying. The prosecution calls it malingering. It's not malingering. Malingering is when you report like a false set of symptoms. But he knows how to look for lying. He's testified in court over and over again. You must, under every single case that he's ever testified in, I can assure you the prosecution has asked, and how do you know you're not being lied to? Well, that's what I'm trained to figure out. That's why I'm skeptical. That's why I won't give an opinion unless I'm sure. So, we brought those people in because they validate what Erik said. And he talks about a history of abuse that it would not have occurred to you or to I submit to you, anybody else to have made up. Because it isn't obvious things. It's things that those people in the field recognize as common patterns of abuse. But no one outside of being a victim or a perpetrator would know about these things. And at one point in her testimony, Dr. Burgess said, in order for Erik Menendez to have faked this detailed and this consistent a history of sexual molestation, he would have needed a research library. Now, Erik is living at the Los Angeles County Jail. He doesn't own that place. That is not a private place. The prosecution had one shred of evidence that Erik had ever had in his cell, so much as a book on child abuse. You would have heard about it. Erik told you that this started out, as Dr. Burgess describes it, as a period of seduction and entrapment. Now, I think a person who's making up a story would have said, when I was 6, my father raped me, to get the dramatic impact, but that's not what he says. When I was 6, my father, who had been massaging me at the pool, starts to massage me in a different way at home. And he proceeds to tell you how he goes through these stages, how his father is, as Dr. Burgess described it, grooming him. Because what's ultimately in the mind of the pedophile is not what he's going to do to the child, but what he can teach the child to do to him. Because after all, he's in there for his sexual pleasure, certainly not for the pleasure of the child. And so in typical fashion, he starts out doing things that to the mind of, remember, this is the throwaway son, the ignored one, the stupid, the weakling, the mediocre, the sissy. So what must it mean to this little boy at 6 that his father now has this special time with him? And the fact of the matter is, sadly enough for the children, sexual molestation, when it isn't violent, has a pleasurable side. It feels nice. And that's how you get the kids hooked. and you tell them, this is our time, and this is our secret. And that entire family was structured to worship Jose Menendez. And so the notion that now Erik would have his own special thing with this man was more than any child would resist, particularly the timid one. And it moves along to the point where Jose can finally get what he wants out of it. And around when Erik is 7 years old, he testifies they're living in the Mill Roadhouse, and his father teaches him how to give a mouth massage. And Erik describes, though, that it wasn't too successful because he gagged because his father pushed his penis in and he hurt him. And here is a medical record from Dr. Katz and Atkin at the Princeton Pediatric Group that has one of these mysterious little unexplained entries, and it is dated December 13, 1977, and Erik is 7 years old, and it says, hurt posterior pharynx, uvula and soft palate, seen in emergency room, Princeton Medical Center, 12/12/77, 8 p.m., follow-up today, healing well, symptomatic treatment. Now, I can't prove that that is penile insertion, but they can't prove that it isn't, because it is consistent with that kind of injury in a small child's throat. And as you heard from our experts, we tried to get the records from the emergency room and they no longer existed. Now, Erik says that his father stopped being nice when he was 11. And in the way that victims blame themselves, Erik thought it was because by that point he had stopped swimming. Well, I don't know why Jose Menendez's sadistic side took over at this point, but it did. And the sex became violent. This is when Erik starts to formulate these funny kid words, this special language for what's going on, and he calls this form of sex, from then on, knees, because he has to get down on his knees to do this. And then he gets the lecture when he cries after this, that why can't you be like your brother? I'm ashamed to have you as a son. You're not going to really measure up as a Menendez, because he's showing signs of weakness. Now, the significant thing about this is that Erik expresses attitudes that how he felt about this, and he expresses it to Dr. Vickery, and he expresses it to Dr. Burgess, and he tells it to you, that I don't think someone who had not been a victim of this would understand. And that is that he thought he was doing something wrong, that he thought it was his fault, that he thought he had brought this on himself. I've already gone over several times the incident of rape. I find what's interesting is that Erik tells you that the worst episode, the one that's most engraved in his head, is not the rape, which occurs when he's between 11 and 12, but the very first time his father was violent. And I think it's interesting that he says that. If he were making it up, if he had not been a victim of this, and I think to our just common knowledge, you'd say, oh, when he sodomized me, when he raped me, that was the worst. That's not what he says. He says the worst one is the first violent one, the first time that knees happens and he's ordered to swallow. And why it's the worst one is because it's the first time his father isn't nice. It blows out the notion that this is somehow love. And what was important to Erik was that he thought, no matter how else his father treated him at other times in his life, that what was going on between them sexually was a form of special love. And when his father becomes violent with him, he knows it isn't love. It's just another thing I have to put up with. And now what his father is showing is the same kind of disdain and dislike and belittling of him that goes on in every other aspect of his relationship with his father. And I don't think a liar could have made that up, that's what's significant to him. One of the things Dr. Burgess talked about that she felt was significant, that isn't the kind of thing that somebody would make up, is the fact that in describing strategies to live with this thing, when he's a little older now, and as she said, when you reach early adolescence, then the children do know it isn't normal. I mean, they can't keep kidding themselves. I mean, it's really hitting, this isn't normal, this isn't right, I'm involved in this bad thing, how do I deal with it? So Erik described some of the strategies, and he said he would put cinnamon in his father's drinks to flavor the semen, because his young friends talked about the fact that you could flavor semen with various things. I mean, I have no idea if that's true. I don't think that's true. But I mean, I think a 13-year-old kid might think that's true. And that's the kind of fact that you wouldn't expect somebody who's making up the story to make up. Erik also talked about the fact that he drowned his food in lemon, and the prosecution thought they scored a major coup when they found out that Maria Menendez, who is Cuban, puts lemon on cooked food. Big shocker. Anybody ever eat Cuban food would realize, yes, you put lemon on Cuban food. Lemon and garlic and onions is the basic flavor, but you don't drown the food in lemon. That's going a little far. And he testified that he did that to deaden taste in his mouth. Now, Erik also testified that, and this is something else you would not expect if someone were making up a story, he testified that, let me back up for a minute. You may remember, I'm not sure how much of this, I've got to be careful here. Mr. Kuriyama may stop me because I'm not real clear on how clear this was made to you about what happened career-wise to Mr. Menendez. But at some point, the family's living in New Jersey. He announces to the family that they're moving to California, and we know he was an executive at RCA Records, and then the next thing we know, he's heading up this video company on the West Coast. And I believe there was testimony that he just wasn't around as much in the last few months that the family was living in Princeton, and I think there's been testimony that's because he's looking for a job and he's on the West Coast. But in any event, what Erik testifies to is that there is a 6-month period that overlaps both the last few months in Princeton and the first 3.5 months in California where there is no sex with his father at all. Now that's very surprising, and if you're coming here and you're making up a story about how awful your life is and that you're being molested, why would there be the 6-month hiatus? And I don't really have an explanation for it, but again, it's a piece of circumstantial evidence about something else. And so here's what my theory is. This is the period. Well, first of all, he's gone a fair amount, and that's clear. Well, it's clear to me. I hope it's clear in the record. But secondly, this is the time when Mrs. Menendez has caught him in the affair. Now, our theory is that Mrs. Menendez knew what was going on, knew right in front of her eyes, knew right behind the eyeballs, knew with very little denial, actually knew, I'm not sure how, but knew enough to be able to let Erik know on Thursday night before she died that she knew. And, I find it hard to believe that with this going on in your own home for 12 years, and you're not even a working mother, you don't even have the excuse of not being there, that you would have no idea. And I have a list of things, apart from what Erik says, which is that she told him she knew. I have a list of things I'll get to soon that I think demonstrate that, yes, indeed, she knew what was going on all these years. But why no sex at this time of great crisis in the family? Remember, she's very depressed, she's very upset, she's crying all the time, she's threatening suicide, all because of Louise Maloney. This affair. And what a charmer Jose is. I mean, let's just take Kitty's part for a second. I can take her part about some of the terrible things that happened in her life, and if she hadn't had children, and if she had killed me, I'd be happy to defend her. But let's just take a look at this for a minute. Not only does he cheat on her for 8 years, but he picks a woman who has her mother's last name and her middle name to cheat with. Mary Louise Menendez. And her mother's name was Maloney. So he picks a Louise Maloney. And what I find truly amazing, in Brian...
I think he did that on purpose? It's really too coincidental to me.
Anderson's representation of himself as so intimate and so close to his sister is that she won't even tell her brother, I have an infidelity problem. And can you imagine the SOB picked a woman named Louise, my middle name, Maloney, mama's name. Doesn't even say that to her brother, who she's so close to. This is a dangerously secretive person. All right. Why is there no sex here? Well, my speculation is that this woman is very upset and threatening divorce. And most allegations of child abuse that come out from adults come out during divorces. This is the bargaining chip of all bargaining chips, particularly in community property states like California. And I submit to you that the sex didn't stop for no reason, that the fact that the sex stopped around this issue of whether this couple were going to divorce. I believe that for the last years of her life, Kitty Menendez had all the power in the world in that family. She had the power of the secret. Because what's never been understood to me is, I can understand her with her negative feelings about divorce and her desire for status and the fact that she's madly in love with this guy and she wants her comfortable life and not wanting to get a divorce. I can understand her. I can't understand him. He doesn't love her. Carlos testifies to that. He tells Carlos in 1980 he doesn't love her. He just wants her around to be wife thing, to run the family. Marzi Eisenberg, the other wife, tells you he doesn't love her. She knows he doesn't love her. He talks in front of other people saying the boys are more important. His little experiment is more important than his relationship with her. He doesn't love her. She's given him a lot of trouble. She can't be fun to be with. She drinks too much. She takes her pills. She cries. She tries to commit suicide. She's a major league drag, I suppose. Why is he still around? Mr. Charm. So desirable. Rich and handsome and brilliant and smart and apparently able to get other women. Well, I think the only answer, it's just inconceivable. The only answer is she's got something on him. Big. Big, big. And not just the right to half the money. And I think that Mrs. Menendez made her deal with the devil, having given him her sons to do with as he pleased from the time they were born. Her deal was they don't get divorced, and she gets to harangue him forever about how miserable he made her, and she keeps the secret. Now, I'm sure she wouldn't want to expose the secret of this family, but it would be one heck of a bargaining chip if he ever tried to divorce her. And you remember Marzi Eisenberg's testimony.
I've really thought this theory before, but hearing her really flesh it out, I totally am on board with this as to why the sudden change in their relationship, Jose and Kitty. All of a sudden, they're showing affection to one another, and he's nice to her, and just a total 180 from what he was. So I really do believe that she had threatened him with divorce, and potentially, maybe she even had evidence. Maybe she even had, she had the photos of them, the naked photos of the boys as they were growing up. They took photos randomly on occasion, and she had possession of those. She's the one that took them, though, for Jose. Potentially. I don't know, but I'm assuming that's probably why she took them. So yeah, I'm fully on board with this theory. I think it sounds good. What do you guys think? After she's fleshing it out, it sounds right to me.
about, oh, Jose was very concerned that she not go off the deep end. He was very worried about her. I mean, and how nice he's treating her all of a sudden. You heard from the family members. He who had always been so sarcastic, he had put her down in public, he had humiliated her, he had done these weird practical jokes on her. All of a sudden, after the discovery of the affair, he's so nice. The honeymooners. They go back east and oh, they're holding hands. Oh, he's listening to her opinion. Even the boys see this. I mean, Lyle tells the story about being at the airport, and she goes off on Jose and starts screaming about Louise, and he's nice to her. He would have gone crazy on her in years before that. Now, what's making him nice? He's such a good guy. He's really worried about whether she's going to commit suicide or not? Sure. No, she's got something on her. Now, that's a theory. That's not evidence, but you can infer it if it makes sense to you. And I think that goes until they have sorted out what's going to happen here with divorce or no divorce, blackmail or no blackmail, the sex stops. And then they sort it out, and the sex starts up again with Erik. And it continues in its various forms, Erik tells you, until several days before his parents are killed. And there's a time when his father puts a knife to his throat, and the threat of death is very blatant. And Dr. Burgess testified that Erik told her many, many, many more details about all the sexual things that were done to him than he testified to. And that's not because he was hiding or lying, but you get to a point with that kind of evidence when you figure, if they don't believe this, what's the point of telling them 3 times more just like it? And it's hard to do that. That's the hardest thing to talk about. And you may remember Dr. Vickery's testimony that Erik was not even willing to talk about it when he started to tell Dr. Vickery about the abuse in August, September 1990. It was not a subject he went to freely and willingly. It was something that he had to constantly get him back to during their interviews. He didn't start out telling him a nice, neat, complete little picture. He started out slowly and gave up the information when he had to. And it was Dr. Vickery indicated that Erik had said that it was not something he ever wanted to have to talk about at his trial. It would have serious repercussions, not just because he was ashamed, because he still blamed himself, because he was embarrassed, but because of what the world would think and how he would be treated by the other inmates in the county jail, which is a matter of some concern. I'm just looking over for a moment Dr. Burgess's notes. And it's interesting that she said that the literature shows that children who aren't particularly special in the way they want to be with a parent will take anything in the terms of feeling special to that parent. And those children are the victim types who are particularly vulnerable. And in fact, Dr. Vickery described Erik as a type of personality that is particularly vulnerable to being the victim of child abuse. Needy and dependent, easily manipulated, sensitive, all of those things. Now, we tried to answer for you the questions that we think people would ask who are not all that familiar with how sexually abused children deal with their lives. We tried to answer for you, why don't they tell people? And boy, we beat that one a lot. And I would hope by now you understand all the reasons why they don't tell people and why they don't just leave. And we tried to make you understand those reasons too. I have a little more to say about that later. But I sense that you understand those issues. I sense that the battle here, if there is still a battle, is to have you believe that this really happened. And all I can say to you is, on a personal level, I don't care if you believe it or not. But as jurors, with the duty of jurors, you have to say, I don't believe it beyond a reasonable doubt in order to reject this evidence. Because if there is even a reasonable doubt in your mind that this happened, you know, logically, this is the only explanation for the chain of events that resulted in these parents' death. And unless you can reject it beyond a reasonable doubt, I would submit to you, you have to accept that this, just as Erik testified, is what precipitated the confrontation with his father and the rolling fear. Because this is what he was never to say. This was the scariest thing he could do. This is 10 coat hangers all at once. This is violating the fundamental rule of Father, God, nature. And he did it. And it terrified him. And it blew up. And it backfired. And there is no explanation the prosecution can offer you that would provide a crisis such as was necessary to lead to the killing of these parents. So I'm still trying to convince you, or at least raise a reasonable doubt in your minds, that this actually happened. And we have tried to show you all the corroboration that we could gather that this sexual molestation by Jose Menendez of Erik indeed happened. We've shown you the photographs. And Kitty kept the photographs. The issue of did Kitty know? She has these photographs. Now, maybe she took them. Great. Talk about aiding and abetting. If she didn't take them and Jose took them, she knows Jose took them. The little light bulb should be going off in her head. There's the medical record. Who do you suppose took Erik to the doctor that day? Mom, maybe? That should have been a tip-off, if that is what I think it is. Diane tells her what Lyle is saying. The little bell should have gone off, the little light bulb. Are we still in denial, Mom?
Yes.
Now, I want you to know, though, apart from whether Mom knows this, why is Mom checking out Erik's genitals? Now, why would Erik make that up? We're not claiming. Oh, maybe we should take a brief.
And when she was doing this, he was an adult. When she was, like a teenager / adult. Like he was up in his teenage years, and she was doing this.
That's okay. It's after lunch. I think people are getting a little sleepy. Maybe a sugar break.
We're getting a break.
Well, look at it this way. It's pouring rain outside, so aren't you glad to be in here nice and dry? Sure. I was talking to you about the evidence that we were able to present that corroborates the sexual molestation in this case. And I have a couple of other things to mention. And not insignificantly is the testimony of Erik's cousin, Andy Cano. Now, I believe the testimony of Andy Cano proves to you that this molestation history is not made up. And the reason I say that is because Andy Cano did not come in here and testify. Erik told me he was raped by his father, and his father was sticking pins in his thighs and tacks in his butt and all this very dramatic and awful stuff that Erik testified to. Andy testified that when he was approximately 10 years old, Erik started to ask him and suggested in asking him that there were massages that he was receiving from his father, and he was concerned about whether they were normal. Now, Dr. Burgess testified that at that age, and Erik would have been 13, that's when molested children are beginning to question whether what is happening to them really is as normal as the pedophile is telling them, or whether their emerging sense of right and wrong and morality is correct, that it is abnormal. Now, how could Erik have known? Erik in jail, it's prosecution theory, have known that that was a classic developmental pattern of sexually abused kids. Because that's what he says to his cousin Andy. And Andy comes in here and says he wanted to know if it was normal. And I told him, I don't know. Because he said to me, does your dad do this to you? Which is a normalizing question. And I said, I don't know, because my dad's not here. Because Andy's parents were divorced, and Peter Cano lives in Puerto Rico. And at that time, Andy was living in New Jersey. So he does not tell a flagrantly dramatic story. He does not tell a made-up story. And if the prosecution's theory is right, and all the members of the family are just dancing to Erik's tune, you know, from these little 20-minute jail visits, they're figuring out what to say, one could assume that Andy would have told a much more detailed story. But all he could tell is what he remembers, and he only remembers two things: massages, and it hurt. And he couldn't figure out why, during the third conversation he had with Erik, Erik told him it hurt, because he couldn't picture a massage that hurt. And it's clear that Erik is very reluctant to talk about the real details of what's going on, so he's using the earliest language of his father, the massages, to explain what's going on. And he's not talking about how at 13 he is being sodomized and stuck with pins, and yes, indeed, that hurts. And I just want you to have some notion. Mr. Curiano says we're going to throw up baby pictures. Well, here's the baby. He's 11 and 12 in these two pictures. He's somewhere between 11 and 12. This is his age when the violence begins. This is what he looks like when he's sodomized by his father. He's not a baby, but he sure is a little boy. And this is what he's like at 9 years old when his father has now trained him in how to conduct anal sex, because he's beginning to groom Erik to be the recipient of same. Just a little schoolboy. And because he's a little boy, you can get him to do these things that you could never get a teenager to do. And here's the happy little children of Jose Menendez. And look how they're standing when you have these photographs. You're going to look at those gruesome ones, and you should. It's your duty. And I'd like you to look at the ones that have some bearing on who these children really were. And Terry Burrell testified, this is Erik and Lyle, the first Easter that they live in New Jersey, standing in front of the church that they're taken to Easter, like little soldiers, their little hands stiff by their side. These are the obedient, happy little faces. Look at the look on both of them. A miserable pair of children. Now, earlier I showed you a photograph from Muncie, and I told you it was the cul-de-sac, and I was mistaken. It was the driveway. It was the street that runs past the Menendez house. So if you would just make a note that Exhibit 156, if someone would write that down so you can tell the others, 156, which is a small photograph, is actually the cul-de-sac, and it's really a much more illuminating photo because you can see the entire circle, and you can understand the difficulty that a kid on a bike would have with centrifugal force in that cul-de-sac. I'm trying to clean this up here so we can move on. The other aspect of the sexual molestation that we believe has been only slightly corroborated, but it is corroboration, is Andy's testimony that there was a time when he was at Erik's house that he hurt himself, and he saw the jar of Vaseline that Erik told you was always kept in his room for when his father needed it. And Andy asked Erik if he could use the Vaseline for his cut, and Erik told him, don't use that, that's not what it's for, and didn't allow Andy to touch that jar of Vaseline. Now, this is a crime scene photograph of Erik's bedroom, and he marked it with a circle to indicate where he was sitting on the Saturday night before the killings, with the gun across his knees while his father was pounding on the door. That was the time he wouldn't let his father in. And we pointed out to you that just as Erik testified, there is a jar of Vaseline sitting next to his bed. Now you can say, well, Vaseline has lots of uses. Okay, well, what was it used for here? No one has come forward to testify that Erik had a pattern of using Vaseline for anything. I don't know of anything. I mean, I only think of Vaseline and thermometers, frankly. So how healthy my life has been. But I don't know what else he used. But you don't use Vaseline for injuries. Unlike Andy, who was only 10 at the time, Vaseline is not really an ointment for sores. And Erik told you that the jar of Vaseline is there because there was always a jar of Vaseline by his bed. And that's a crime scene photograph taken by the Beverly Hills Police Department. Now, I pointed out to you that there are a few things that corroborate the abuse that also lend credence to the notion that Kitty Menendez always knew what was going on. But the other things that I think point that out, I've indicated to you she's checking out Erik's genitals, and it's hard to understand what she's looking for, except she's doing that during the period of time when these activities that he described by his father with implements, tying, he said he would tie him. It went by very quickly, and it was not the kind of question I was going to ask him about again, but he said he would tie him with a rope and then give him oral sex. And that's happening, and the needles along the penis is happening then. And Mom, at this point, is showing this tremendous interest in his genitals and checking him out. Now, that's a strange thing to make up if that didn't really happen. And we know she had a sort of weird thing in her life with Lyle as well, giving him baths. Forget about what Lyle says happens. Just think in terms of what Diane says. That Diane knows that Kitty Menendez is giving Lyle at 13 and 14 baths and shampoos. Now, it is some of you were mothers, and all of you were children, and it's very strange for a mother to be so invasive even of the privacy of a teenage son as to assist him in his bath taking at that age. So her invasion into their, if you will, genital privacy is very strange. She also, as you heard through our experts who had privy to Dr. Summerfield's notes, she also, without ever revealing anything of consequence in therapy, makes reference to sick secrets. Erik also testified that although his mother would come when he would be throwing up because he was sick, she never came when he was throwing up because of the activities with his father. She never knocked on the door. This is a very busy and successful businessman. He's like, some big mucky muck in RCA, and then he's president of the company with Live Entertainment, and he gets all these business calls, but never, ever, during any of the time that he is alone with Erik in his room, is there ever even a phone call. Well, obviously, that's not true. There must have been phone calls, but she is a non-interferer. She isn't going to go in that room. And what is it that she doesn't want to walk in on? And then the other thing, which I think Mr. Kuriyama wants to put a slightly different twist on, is what is this pressure that she's putting on Erik to get a girlfriend when they're living in California? What is it she's worried about, okay? Well, Erik says that he figures that she's worried that he's gay. Now, why would she worry that he's gay? Well, he tells you he was very sexually inhibited because he was afraid when he was a young teenager that if he got involved with girls, or anybody, I suppose, they would find out that he was having sex with his father. He thought it was obvious. He thought he wouldn't be able to keep that secret. And yet, when he finally gets involved in a very intense relationship with a young girl named Kirsten, he realizes he can do that and Kirsten won't figure it out. And Kirsten didn't figure it out. But there was a point when he broke off his relationship with Kirsten because the sex with his father was making it impossible to be with her, that it would interfere with his relationship with the girlfriend because of what was happening with his father. And there were 2 periods of his life when he was with this girl, Kirsten. And this is the girlfriend that he came up with when his mother was pressuring him. And I interpret Kitty's pressuring him that it's okay because of whatever her trade-offs were in her life for her husband to be having sex with her son, but God forbid the neighbors should think as a result that her son is homosexual, because God forbid they should figure out if he were that, what made him that. Now, these are not very sophisticated people, obviously, when it comes to matters of sexuality. These are not very sophisticated people when it comes to matters of child rearing. And I don't think that you can make a person homosexual. But I think you can definitely screw up the boundaries of a child if you are forcing same-sex sex on him when that isn't his natural predilection. And therefore, Erik was very concerned and very confused at a period of his life as to whether or not what was going on with his father meant something about himself. And I think his mother's only concern was not, what is this doing to Erik? Is the poor boy confused? Is this hurting him? But the splendid and perfect Menendezes can't have a child so imperfect as to be homosexual. And therefore, he better get a girlfriend. She knew darn well he wasn't homosexual. She knew darn well what he was molested. Yeah. And so with all this having happened to him, who did he wind up being? Erik Menendez. I'm going to stand over. Well, no, I'll use the little one again, just to make it easier for all of you. When he was this baby, and we have baby pictures, I won't bother putting them up. You'll see them. He's real cute, like most babies. When he was a baby and a toddler, his Aunt Martha describes him as open and happy and friendly and outgoing, and his Aunt Terry calls him a child with a sunny disposition. And it all changes. And what changed it? Because as a child and a teenager, and I went through everything that everybody who testified in this trial said about him, and this is what they said about him. Nice kid. That was Marzi Eisenberg. Very good kid. Embarrassed. Insecure. Very shy. Very sad. Distressful. Very emotional. Lonely. Sensitive. Distrustful. Can't imagine why. Too soft. Too tender, too mediocre, and that's Jose Menendez speaking. Respectful, very disciplined, nice to mother, tearful, frightened, tried very hard, applied himself, quiet, introverted, not happy, very obedient, excitable, crier and whiner, that was Alan, polite, soft, tender, loved family, that's Aunt Terry, affectionate, well-behaved, kind of gentle, fragile, Sandy Sharp, needy, vulnerable, caring, anxious, fearful, fun-loving, naive, unsophisticated, immature, and this is a description of him at 18. Learning disabled, spaced out, robotic, and that's a description of how he acts around his father when he's being criticized. Afraid, seeking approval, gifted athlete. Now show me here, arrogant, show me vicious, show me cruel, show me cold, show me heartless, show me conscienceless, show me pitiless, show me mean, show me any of the things that his parents were. Show me a killer, because he isn't here and he isn't there. And this is what he's like after this cold-blooded first-degree murderer. Lost and confused. This person who does not want to be controlled by his father, that's their theory. What does he do afterwards? Gives his money to his Aunt Martha and asks everybody in the world, what should I do with my life? What should I do with my life? And puts himself in an 8 to 10 hour a day, vigorous training program, back to work with Mark Heffernan. This person who didn't want control. What does he do, go to the beach? Yeah, he goes to Cancun with Maravich because he wants to kill himself. And while down there, he tells Meredith how he doesn't trust her zeal. But what does he take off and become the playboy of the Western world? No, he keeps looking for structure. He keeps looking for control. That's why they go to Mark Slack, someone they didn't even know. And they're asking perfect strangers, what do we do with our life? What do we do now? Lost and confused and scared, somber and upset and crying. He spoke at the memorial service in Los Angeles and cried. Was he being hypocritical? No. The tragedy of this is that to this day he doesn't hate them. To this day he loves his parents and only remembers the good of them. Depressed, agitated, felt isolated, alienated, suicidal, despairing, overwhelmed with guilt, and overwrought. And that's before he's arrested. And you heard from Dr. Vickery what he was afterwards. A basket case on the brink of a psychotic break. Now, you don't become this after someone dies. This is what you always were. And you do not wake up one morning when you are this person and say, I shall kill my parents. That is inconceivable. There really is good and evil in this world. There really is. There really are good people and bad people. And sadly enough, given where we are, Erik Menendez is a good person who did a bad thing. And you cannot judge the sinner by the sin alone, because you will never understand what to call the sin unless you look at the person who did it. Now, before I get to going through the last days, I want to see if I can help you understand something that frankly was once hard for me to understand, because this is not the first parasite case involving an abused child that I've ever been involved in. And I recognize that the hardest thing for people to understand is why these children, why a child like Erik, because you can take a child in an abused family and put them completely over the edge. There can be children who are so abused that they are psychotic, they are insane, and they can kill in delusional states, and this happens, and that's very tragic. And moreover, I mean, if the abuse is really bad enough, and you cannot predict when that's going to happen, because every person is born with a different sensitivity to treatment, to maltreatment. Some people can handle a lot of it, and some people can handle very little of it. And you hear stories, for example, of multiple personalities. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book, Sybil, which was one of the most devastating things that I've ever read, about an infant who is tortured. And in order to survive, the coping mechanism of an infant who can't cognate, who can't think, I'll be better off later, I can wait to go to college. An infant doesn't have that ability. So for the organism to survive, the infant splits and takes herself away. The conscious self leaves so that the conscious self does not have to experience the excruciating pain of the torture that's inflicted on that infant. And that's how you form multiple personalities. Very, very seriously mentally ill people. And they understand now in trying to, and it's very rare as well, but they understand in working with multiple personality people now that they're almost exclusively the creation of extreme physical abuse under the age of 3. Under the age when a person can come up with more cognitive coping mechanisms. But Erik's extreme abuse didn't begin till much later, and so he was able to cope with it in rational ways. Okay, but the point of this is how to make people understand. Oh, and then one other thing I wanted to say about parasite cases. There are also cases in which children are mentally ill, seriously mentally ill, and it is not caused by any maltreatment by their parents. Because one of the terrible tragedies of really serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, is it doesn't have anything to do with how you treat someone. It is a disease, the origin of which is not very well understood. And there are many families, and I know some of them, where at a certain age, their children just become extremely mentally ill, and they've been wonderful parents. And there have been cases where extremely mentally ill psychotic children have killed their parents. And it had nothing to do with abuse, but those are also called parasite cases. But we do not have here an extremely mentally ill kid. We have here the person as described. And what's very hard for those of us who didn't live through this kind of experience to understand is how can their perception of the universe be so different than ours? In other words, why can't they just leave? Now, if Erik, let me see if I can explain it because it's a hard concept and I'm not a psychiatrist, but if Erik had had other experiences in his life besides the intense one of his own family, he is, remember, very isolated into this 4-person unit that is this family. And everything he knows about people and everything he knows about relationships is what he is learning inside this family. And his parents are people of very extreme emotions. And they are people who never let him develop any sense of independence. What that means is he never has any idea that he is a competent person, that he can solve his own problems, that he has certain rights, in fact, to certain treatment. And they're so plugged in, these kinds of children in these families, to the family myths of the parents being perfect and the parents always being right, that it doesn't even occur to them that they're being abused, that this is an abnormal family. And if you don't have that notion, you don't have a right to be angry. And you don't have a right to stand up for yourself. You can't pick up the coat hanger if you don't think that you're ever right. And in this family, only the parents are right. If Erik had the insight of the prosecution theory is, all right, maybe he's being abused and he's being controlled, and so he figures out, I'm being controlled, this is unfair, I want to get out of here. If he had the insight of that theory to know that he was being controlled and abused and could say to himself, my father was no good. He's a sadist. My mother is no good. She's sadistic. It's not our fault that they don't love us. If he had that much insight into what was going on in the family, he would have been healthy, like we are. He would have been healthy enough to know, hey, I'm walking. But he didn't have that insight. Where was he going to get it from? What was the norm that he was supposed to compare these people to? And what were the resources that he had for support? We talk about the battered wife, and we talk about Kitty Menendez, and Dr. Briere talked about the difference between the battered wife and the abused child, and how much worse the lot of the abused child is, because they have no experience outside this family to know what's normal, to know what's good, to know who's to blame. The battered wife at least comes into that relationship with previous life experiences. She can tell. She has a sense of fair, unfair. Now, she can get ground down because, as he explains, if you're in a situation where you're hit and every time you get up, you're hit again, sooner or later you stop getting up. And that's known as learned helplessness. But it's trained helplessness in a child. So neither Erik nor Lyle, I believe, had any understanding then about what was wrong with their family. And since they don't understand the right and wrong of it, they don't have the sense of anger. And this is clear also from Dr. Vickery's testimony. He was never angry at his parents. If he had been, he would have been healthier. He would have known, I'm me and they're them and they're wrong and I'm right and I can have my anger. And anger in that family by the children was certainly not encouraged. What was encouraged, what was generated, was fear. Fear was the permissible emotion. Look how much energy these parents spent in engendering fear. And Erik was raised to be a fearful child, and Erik was a fearful child, and fear was the one emotion that was allowed to him. And so here he is, experiencing a great deal of turmoil and unhappiness. He could not be otherwise, given this life, and it all translates into fear of these powerful people. Now, I don't know if that explains it, but there's a little more. Okay. You see, what happened in this family was that Jose particularly played upon every little kid's feeling that their parent is perfect and that their parent is a hero. And in this family, Jose's perfectionism and Jose's heroism is writ large by everybody. And then what a parent, this is our scientist in this experiment, what that parent can do is he can pound on that child and deprive that child of any kind of perspective. He's got so much power that he takes away from that child any ability to understand what's wrong with the parent. This is a real perversion of this parent-child bond, where the children naturally look up to the parent, and the parent uses that to twist it into a system where theirs is the only truth. Theirs is the only reality. And as I said to you before, in this particular home, the parents act in very extreme ways. So Erik never even learned any perspective on a normal range of feelings or a normal type of relationship. And that's why he could believe, growing up in this fearful atmosphere, that these parents who were so extreme for so many years truly could kill him. Now, he expresses on a conscious level during those last days why it is he can't run away. And I don't think he even understands all the reasons why he can't run away. But not having been a lazy child ever, what are the resources available to him, let us say, during that last week, if he had scanned it and thought about running away? He was worked very hard as a child, but obviously he was never trained to work. He has a semi-high school education, and I say that because it's impossible to know whose work got him his grades. I mean, he's got a diploma, but that's all he is a high school graduate with no skill and no training. And where is he going to go? If he goes to the only relatives he really knows, because he hardly knows Joan Vandermolen, and he doesn't know Pat Anderson that well, we can see the warm and cheerful reception he probably would have received from Uncle Brian, but where is he supposed to go? He's supposed to go to Terry and Carlos and say, I've run away from home. Now, as I say, Terry and Carlos are very nice people, but they were spies for Jose and Kitty Menendez. They testified. They reported everything that Lyle did wrong right back to the parents. Now, can Erik go to them and say, I've run away from home because Dad is molesting me? And when Erik testifies it was out of the question, you can see how out of the question it was. What are those people going to do? Are they going to believe him? And if they believe him, can they protect him? Are they going to stand up to Jose Menendez? I mean, I think the only reason they can believe it now is because they're dead. And something terrible had to be going on. And that's what Terry Barral testified to. I know these boys. They wouldn't have killed their parents based on just what I saw. Something terrible had to have happened. And indeed, that's the only explanation for what happened here. But where was he supposed to run? And is Jose Menendez and Kitty Menendez, are they really going to let them out? I mean, these are the people they've controlled constantly. These are the people whose performance and whose perfection is so important to them. They're just going to let him walk away. I mean, Kitty tracked Jose's mistress to New York. I think that in his position, with his fear of these people and his understanding of their relentlessness, it is not hard to understand, or it should not be hard to understand, why there seemed to be no options and no choices when the crisis started. Now I want to talk about what happened during that last period of time. We talk about it as the last week, but it wasn't just a week. It started before that. This is the killer, according to the prosecution theory. This is a photograph taken in Louisville, Kentucky on July 27, 1989. This is less than a month away. And this is Erik working on his little playbook. This is the place where he played more matches than any other kid, this kid who has to get off his butt and go to work, and where he nearly collapsed from heat exhaustion in his efforts to please the folks. And this is a picture that was also taken on that same trip in Louisville of Kitty and Jose Menendez. And what happens during this tennis tour of the summer is very significant, because it is clear that what has happened in the Menendez family, particularly, well, with respect to both parents, but in different ways, is this. Having struggled all these years with their very strange ideas of how to create perfect little clones of Jose, it has finally been brought home to these people that their little experiment in human development has not worked, that you really cannot create perfect children through abuse and torture and molestation and pressure and belittling and degrading and dependency, which is what they have been doing with their kids. And the children, surprisingly enough, are not perfect. And they are not just disappointed. They are disgusted. This is not what they wanted. They wanted perfect little trophies. And if you're not a perfect little trophy, they don't have a great deal of use for you. And this is the message, I believe, that starts to get transmitted to both of the boys at least a year before the killings. Now, yes, Erik committed a crime. Okay? And I talked to you yesterday about what you can do with that information. But the really interesting thing about that is how extraordinary it is for a kid from a well-off family to be committing a theft offense. This is a clear indication that something is wrong. Okay? So what is the parental reaction? Cover up and criticism, not for an immoral act, but for a stupid one. Because this is how they deal with their children. And this comes out over and over again. Jose Menendez's problem with these theft offenses was not the $12,000 in restitution he had to make, but the fact that the kids were once again stupid. They were not nearly as clever as he would have been. They are not the perfect product. He would have done it better. And his disgust about those episodes have nothing, I submit to you, to do with being morally outraged or being critical of his children for having done such a thing. It's because they didn't get away with it. They weren't clever enough. They weren't being Menendez's. That's what bothered him about it. But that is bad enough in his rule book, because his children have to be clever like he is and brilliant like he is, no matter who they really are. And so what happens then, of course, is Erik winds up at Dr. Oziel's. Now, if you knew nothing else about Dr. Oziel, but that he had this family in September of '88, and the children killed the parents in August of '89, that should be enough of a recommendation of the man, I should think. But what happens here is perhaps Erik's last chance. And as fate would have it, I've always wondered, you know, I never liked the word karma very much in the 70s when it was popular, okay? But there is something to be said about a notion of miserable luck or a bad sign under which one can be born. And as Erik knows, because we have talked about this, he has had the worst karma of anyone I've ever known. It isn't bad enough that he was born to these two people who, if they had only married somebody else, their kids might have had a fighting chance. If either one of them had been a halfway decent parent, this dreadful thing wouldn't have happened. But when both extremely bad parents get together, this is why you have this crime. But apart from the dreadful karma of having been born to these two people, and the dreadful things that they did, and the fact that he was just talented enough that they could get away with all this pressure. What if he hadn't been a decent athlete at all? That would have been a whole area of pressure that he wouldn't have to have lived under. But it's this constant mixed blessing. He was a great athlete, so they could push him and pressure him and make his life miserable. Just an aside on that point, something I meant to say, and I may as well say it now. We talked before about children who can become seriously mentally ill when they're abused with the regularity, with the relentlessness as what went on in this family. One of the things that saves children, and one of our experts mentioned this, is physical exercise. Now, it is true that the sports training was torture, but I truly, truly, truly believe that it saved his life, that it saved his sanity for sure. Because through all that physical activity, so much of the tension and the stress is relieved. And beyond that, through the fact that God, with his sense of humor, made him a great athlete in spite of all the negative things in his life, there was something in which about which he could think well of himself. He could get some positive stuff, not so much from the parents, because it was always conditional. As everyone said, he never was praised for a good performance. He was simply told, right, now next time, don't do this and don't do this and don't do this. So it certainly wasn't from the parents, but from the peer group, from the world, from the other relatives. He had some sense of being worthwhile and being accomplished from the sports. And I believe that is why he wasn't psychotic before. And luckily, Dr. Vickery caught him in time that he wasn't after either. But I knew by doing that I was gonna sidetrack myself, and so I did. All right, karma. The worst, karma and Oziel, they always go together in my mind. So here he is with his last clear chance, and who does blind fate send him to but the sex therapist in Beverly Hills? You know, if he had just wound up at that point in the hands of anybody decent, he would have been saved. This wouldn't have happened. But he gets this guy who has no notion of, you heard all that dual relationships? And here is a guy with an adolescent acting out. That's what this, I don't like that phrase, acting out. It makes it seem very minor. It's not minor. It was a real serious thing that he was involved in a theft offense. And it should have been treated real seriously from a psychological standpoint. Not because of the amount of money involved. But here he is with Oziel. And there should have
Right, it was a cry for help.
been bells going off all over the place that there's something very wrong in this family. And absolutely the worst thing you can do then is to do a therapy that isn't confidential for the kid. to not set up a situation where that kid could ever trust you enough, or it would ever be safe enough for him to tell you what's really going on. And Oziel testified, I showed him one, he told us, of the more than one waivers of confidentiality that wound up being part of the operational scheme of his therapy with Erik in 1988 and 1989. Now that is such a disaster. Here was possibly a chance for all this to stop, for things to get sorted, at least for the kids. I don't think you could do much with these parents. I mean, Kitty Menendez was in therapy for 3 years and had moved nowhere, and Jose was not the therapy type. But at least there could be some support there for the kid. If you can create an environment, as our expert said, where the kid is free to talk, even if he can't get out of the home, he can figure out, maybe for the first time, you know what, kid? It wasn't your fault. But no, he's got an Oziel who knows who pays the bills. And who pays the bills is Kitty and Jose. And Kitty and Jose are not about to let their kid be in therapy where he could talk. And the bottom line is this is no therapy at all. This is a smokescreen for the juvenile court. And by the way, Mr. Kuriyama, when he's talking about that last year, and he's talking about the theft, offense, and the crime, he's talking about Erik as an adult. Erik was 17 in 1988 for most of the year, and that's why his case went to juvenile, not adult court. And in this case, I don't think it makes the slightest difference, frankly, if Erik was 17 when his parents were killed, 18 when his parents were killed, or any age, because in his life, those people never, ever let go. He was never free of their influence. And that's why Lyle's situation in that sense is not really any different than Erik's. Lyle could be in school 3,000 miles away, and his life is being run by these parents. Okay, so what happens over the course of that last summer? Well, it is clear that these people now, not having made the perfect product, as Carlos Baralt testifies, are now ready to throw them away. And I submit to you that what happens in the last weeks is, rather than the children rising up against the parents go to war against the children. They are disgusted. They didn't turn out the way they wanted. They don't have any tolerance for them. I mean, Erik is still a weakling who never performed properly, and now he's lost the biggest tournament of his life. So he is utterly worthless to Jose Menendez at this point. And all their mother wants is to get them out of her life, finally, so she can have a romantic fantasy totally to herself. She wants them away. She wants them out of her life. She's feeling sorry for herself that she sacrificed her career, her ambitions as a beauty queen, as whatever it was she wanted to be. And now is the time. She's looking to be an empty nester with a vengeance. She wants these boys gone. They have no value to these parents anymore. They didn't turn out the way they wanted, okay? And for Jose Menendez, the proof of that is that Erik has the effrontery, exhausted and in the middle of a heat wave, and given what he has done in Louisville, he has the effrontery to lose to a lower-ranked player who, in his parents' assessment, he should not have lost to. And, of course, he gets blamed for Lyle's camcorder. These are the last straws. And these parents go to war, okay? And how is that demonstrated? Well, Kitty's father is up in Canada. He's got cancer. She wants to go see him. They're supposed to go up there after Kalamazoo like every year. So what does Jose do? He decides, we're not going. Now, who's he punishing with this? This is because he's angry at Erik for having lost, right? He's not punishing Erik, though. He decides to punish Kitty. See, all the way through, that's how he maintained power in this family, the old divide and conquer, okay? He made sure Kitty never allied with the kids. He made sure the kids didn't ally with Kitty. He tells Erik, your mother's not your friend, she's my friend. And nothing could have been truer in this family, because she never acts like the children's friend. She's always the ally of Jose. And now what he does is an interesting power play. He's going to punish Kitty because Erik lost. Now, how is that going to make Kitty feel? Angry at Erik, blaming the boys, which is what she does when she gets punished by Jose. Yep. So he cancels Canada. He cancels Erik going back to tennis camp in Florida. We're all going home to LA. And then he's going to read Erik the riot act. You're going to go to college, and you're going to take what I want, and that's how it's going to be. And he's just kicking him around because he's angry. And he knows he's got the power, and he knows he can do that. But what he doesn't know is that Erik has been clinging to life with one idea. When I go to college, this is going to end. And when Jose tells him, here's how it's going to be, and throws in the zinger that you're going to be home several nights a week. Now, this is just sadistic, okay? This is just typical Jose. Punish everybody because he's pissed off about something. Be really sadistic. You know the kid's been wanting to go to college. Tell him, I'm not sure you're going to play on the tennis team. This kid's been working so hard all summer long, working so hard year in and year out to be a tennis player in college. And now he says, well, I don't know if you're going to be on the tennis team in college. I'll decide that too. Just flexing his muscles, just throwing his weight around. The trouble is he miscalculated. He miscalculated how tenuous Erik's grasp on life was. He miscalculated that the kid was not 13 anymore. Now he's 18. And at 18, he's going through a 16-year-old struggle for independence, and he can't allow it to go on. He has only kept himself going by the belief that it's going to stop. And now, when he hears from his father it isn't going to stop, he cannot take it anymore. No matter how much his father threatens or how much his father bullies, he can't do it. He's at the end of his rope. And Kitty, of course, having been taken back home, I mean, why she doesn't go to Canada by herself is because she never will let Jose out of her sight. This is her jealousy and her obsessiveness about him. In any event, she goes to war on her favorite target, which is Lyle. And they have this fight over the hairpiece. Now remember, they come back on August 9th. There are tickets, I think we've indicated, that show when they return from Chicago. They come back on August 9th, and within a few days, Erik testifies he has the first of his meetings with his father, where his father tells him what his future is going to be. And that's not really news to him, and that doesn't really bother him in particular. It's the next conversation where his father tells him exactly what classes he's going to take and the fact that he's going to be coming back home that tells him that his life of servitude to this man as his little sex object and that his life of punishment with that kind of behavior isn't going to end. And he tells you, however, that when his father talks about, and maybe there's no tennis team, that is sort of a mixed message. Because on the one hand, yes, he's been training for the tennis team. That is a great source of his self-esteem, and it's what he did want. On the other hand, no tennis means no pressure. It means no criticism, at least in one area. It means no heat exhaustion in the middle of the summer. I mean, it has a glimmer of maybe some free time, which he's never had. So it's a kind of mixed message, but the real message is, I'm angry at you. I'm punishing you. That's the real message from all of this. So he feels at this point, as he's described, that all of his hope for rectifying his life is gone, and he's right. I mean, this is a real perception. This isn't an unreasonable person's perception. And he says he went off and cried and felt sorry for himself, and he wanted to leave the house for a few days, and his mother steps in there and tells him he's not going anywhere and he's not doing anything, and she's throwing her weight around because she's probably mad at him because he's cost her the trip to Canada where she wants to see her father who has cancer. In any event, after he has this angry words with his mother, his father comes in and in typical Jose style says, going somewhere? Are you going somewhere? You've got a problem, pal? And of course, Erik says, no, he's not going to get into an argument with his father, but his father says, I will deal with you when I come back, because he's going on a business trip that week. And this is not his typical business trip, like the one that we believe was scheduled for the following week. This isn't one day to Minneapolis and back. As Roger Smith testified, this is like a 3-day trip. Excuse me. Okay. On Tuesday afternoon, Erik says he oversees and overhears this argument between his mother and his brother. And at the end of this argument, his mother rips off Lyle's hairpiece. Now, I think this is going to take some. Decided to stop here so I can walk around. So tight. Now I'll fold this up. And that'll make the blood circulate. Now, oh, look, a new view. Maybe that'll wake me up. Okay. I'm not really boring myself. It's just I haven't slept much in the last week or so. Maybe I'm boring you. But anyway, let's talk about this episode. Now, let me just say that if Erik knew that his brother wore a hairpiece, it would still have been shocking to see his mother tear it off. Because this is the kind of hairpiece that isn't just put on every morning. It's not, as Mr. Kuriyama would so, well, I don't know what his motive is on this one. Maybe he doesn't know the right word. But he keeps calling it a wig. Maybe it's just to humiliate and embarrass Lyle. I don't know. But it's not a wig, it's a toupee, and it's a toupee that's affixed in a certain way so that it hurts when you take it off. And whether he knew about it or didn't know about it, the point of the story is that she humiliates Lyle. She does a violent thing, and she embarrasses him, and she shows his baldness, which you've never seen in this courtroom. And that's what's so shocking to Erik. Now the prosecution's going to make a big deal over the notion that Erik lied about knowing about his brother's hairpiece. Nuh-uh. Jamie Pisarcik lied. Erik didn't lie about this. Okay? Erik testified, I knew that something had been done with Lyle's hair because it looked so different. What I didn't know is that it was that. It was a toupee that you could tear off. That's all he said. Now, Miss Pisarcik, who other people called the gold digger, came in and testified that for the first time in November 2nd, November 3rd, 1993, when the Magic Eye has been televising every single day relentlessly of this trial, in November, long after Erik and Lyle have testified, she tells Detective Zoller the following story. In the spring of 1989, I was at the Menendez home, and Erik overheard a conversation of his mother, which informed him that Lyle wore a toupee. And Erik acknowledged to me, I'm not quoting her, this is the gist, and Erik said to me, oh yes, I didn't know that in the beginning, but I know it now, and that explains, I was so surprised to find out he had a toupee, but that explains why his hair is always in place. Now that's the story that she tells Detective Zoller. Detective Zoller's gone fishing, by the way. It's not like she calls up to say this is the story. They're looking in their desperation for anything to try to overcome this enormous case that the defense has put on here. So Zoller says, what do you know about the hairpiece? Did you know anything about the hairpiece? Did Erik know about the hairpiece? I bet Erik knew about the hairpiece. I can just see this. This is not a tape-recorded conversation, by the way. This is not a tape-recorded interview between Zoller and Miss Pisarcik. So we don't exactly know how it evolved. But she tells him it's the spring of 1989. And she takes the witness stand. And she testifies on direct examination that it is the late spring, early summer. So is that May? Is that June, we wonder? Those of us who have a notion that the year is divided into 4 distinct seasons. So then on cross-examination, Miss Lansing starts to question her about when is this, and she then, I guess, remembering that she broke up with Lyle in April and therefore couldn't be back here in late spring, early summer makes it just spring. Okay, so what's just spring? Well, just spring is April. But she was working in April, so just spring is now March. And then, of course, out come her work records, which show that there is no way except for one weekend that she could have come out here in March in order to overhear this or to have, out of the blue, this conversation that she says she had with Erik. And when I say out of the blue, I cross-examined her. And I asked her, what preceded this conversation? What did you do before? What did you do after? Why did it come up? How did it come up? Where were you going? Why were you on the second floor of the house when you're hanging out in the guest house? And we all know Mrs. Menendez can't stand her. And she has no answers. I don't remember. Nothing. Oh, but this little helpful conversation. This, she says, she remembers. Now, you cannot, I don't care how good a cross-examiner you are, you cannot very often get a witness to say, you're right, I lied. Doesn't happen. Once in a while you get a witness who's trying to be honest to say, I made a mistake and I was wrong, like Erik did. But you can't get someone like this who says, you're right, I lied. The only thing you can do is try to show that they lied about any significant portion of what they're saying. Well, there's only two portions. There's only two parts to what she's saying. What was said and when. Two facts. That's all there are. Okay? And in fact, she backs off of the what was said because she says, well, it wasn't, I didn't overhear. See, because what she originally says is she overhears Mrs. Menendez giving this information to Erik and then has a conversation with Erik about it. She backs off of that. Okay? Even Solar tries to help her by backing off along with her. But this is what's in his report. That she says Erik overheard a conversation with his mother, and then she has a conversation with Erik. So she backs off of that, she changes that. But more important, we get her. We got her. You can tell these moments in a court. Some of the stuff we do is pretty subtle. Valentine, you will admit, was not subtle, right? Pisarcik was not subtle either. She's sitting up here. She says it happens in the spring. Here comes Miss Lansing with envelope after envelope of her work records and blows her out of the water. She lied. And she shows she lied. And you get down to that one weekend in March, and it is the weekend when Erik isn't there. Because he's at the Doral in Florida, on the tennis circuit, playing in the Easter Bowl. Here are the travel records that show it. Here are the credit card charges that show the families in Florida, the only weekend in the springtime when Jamie Pisarcik could have been at the Beverly Hills house, and she's lying. So now where does it go? Oh, well, Miss Lansing says, well, now that we know it's not March, how about February? Oh yeah, it was February, so take it through the February work records. And there's no time in February for her to have come. So then Miss Lansing says, so now you're going to say it was January? And the question really is, so now you're going to lie again? Well, it was when I was there seeing Hurly Burly. And Hurly Burly, as you will understand from the stipulation, ran between November and January. So now, the spring is the winter. And yet you're supposed to believe this witness. And as I've indicated to you before, Ed Fenno testified that he's around the Menendez brothers a lot and he didn't know about the hairpiece. And moreover, the whole family testified, virtually. And none of them indicated they knew about the hairpiece. There was one other area, of course, that Ms. Pisarcik testified about in front of you. And that had to do with the use of the credit card. And I won't take you through that whole elaborate thing, but it's clear she wasn't being honest. She was improperly, she and her entire family, according to her, were using the Menendez family phone card and running up these huge charges. It was, stealing, okay? And she's doing that long after she's broken up with Lyle, and she's claiming that she did it that first week, the week that we first showed her the billing records on, because she's trying to put herself and Lyle together at this tournament, and Mrs. Menendez gave her permission. And we know Mrs. Menendez did not want to encourage in any way Jamie and Lyle being together again. So she lied about the telephone credit card, and then when Miss Lansing shows her it wasn't just that week that it was being used, then she makes up the story, well, Lyle had given my whole family permission to use it, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, I don't know all of Miss Pisarcik's motives to make up stories, but here she is willing to testify against a young man that she was engaged to marry who has never done a bad thing to her. You didn't hear of any rotten thing that Lyle ever did to her, such as would make her want to pay him back. But nevertheless, she's willing to come into court in a death penalty case. That's the kind of person she is, you see, and testify against him. And I submit to you, somebody that heartless is also willing to make up a lie to help the prosecution to get Erik. But the bottom line is, what happens on Tuesday night, Tuesday afternoon in the Menendez home, the significant part of that episode is the shock of the mother tearing off Lyle's hairpiece and embarrassing Lyle, and the fact that now we know the next time in Erik's presence since 4 years old when Lyle cried. And it's when he's 29 and he's in this house. And so Erik decides to go and tell him what happened. Now, what's interesting about the Tuesday night discussion where Erik tells Lyle, because he's feeling suicidal and miserable and his life is not going to work out, and he goes and tells Lyle that what went on with his father that Lyle knew about earlier. I don't know if you remember this aspect of their history, but Lyle figured out when he was a young teenager that Jose was molesting Erik because he could hear things. He was in the next bedroom, and he could hear things. He didn't have to go down the hall to try to hear things. And he figured out what was going on, and he had a little confrontation then with his father. And although his father denied it, his father indicated not to worry, right? And then Lyle says that he talked to Erik subsequently, asking Erik in some way if things were okay between Erik and Dad. And Erik, who had gotten a beating from Jose, because Jose thought Erik had told Lyle, and that's how Lyle knew. Erik tells Lyle, no, don't worry, everything's fine, it's all over, okay? Or words to that effect. So now Lyle is finding out that it wasn't all over, and that his brother hadn't told him the truth, and that this has been going on. And now if this was a made-up story, folks, what would you make up would be Lyle's reaction? Oh, Erik, how awful for you. Oh, Erik, how terrible. Oh, Erik, what a miserable thing for him to do. Oh, Erik, I'm so sorry. And is that Lyle's reaction? No. What you hear testified to here is Lyle's initial reaction is, I didn't believe him, and I was angry. And he doesn't believe him, and he's angry because he doesn't want to believe that his baby brother was being treated that badly and he didn't do anything to stop it. And he wasn't the one his brother came to. And that state of mind on Lyle's part is all of a piece of how Lyle and Erik grew up and how they related to each other in this family. And it is not the story that liars would tell. I submit.
And Lyle still blames himself for not being able to protect Erik. And I'm sure Erik blames himself for getting Lyle involved and getting it to escalate to where it did. So they both feel like they are the reason each other is in jail right now or prison.
Because it isn't logical. It makes sense in the context of this family, but it isn't the kind of thing you'd make up. And so they then have a discussion, and by the end of the discussion, Lyle is no longer angry at Erik. I mean, he even accuses him of liking it. Now, that's not the kind of thing I think that would be said if the story was being made up. In any event, what's resolved that night is that Lyle, who has had this very strange experience that's different than Erik's with his father. Lyle has sort of been built up on the one hand and torn down on the other. He has been given the notion since he is the firstborn, since he is the heir apparent, that he really is a Menendez, that he too is one of the superior creatures such as Jose and Kitty. And because his father has had these long talks with him, I think the kid's been given the false impression that he actually has his father's respect, that his father will actually listen to him. But deluded creature that he is, Lyle believes that. Lyle actually believes, which shows you how distorted the perception of the children in this family is. Lyle actually believes that he's going to be able to sit down with his father and say, you have to stop molesting Erik. Okay, Dad? And I'm going to take Erik back with me to Princeton, or I'm going to come here and go to UCLA and live with Erik. But really, Dad, it's not right for you to do that, so you're going to have to stop. And this is how distorted Lyle's perception is, that he thinks because he has been told all of his young life by his father that he was special and he was a Menendez, that he can have such a conversation with him. And it doesn't seem to occur to him how bizarre this is. That you can't go and tell your father, stop buggering my brother. Can't do that. Not with a Jose Menendez. But you see, that's my point about their lack of perception. He doesn't understand just how strange all this really is. This isn't like negotiating over your college roommate, but he has no perspective. So he decides he's going to be able to do this. And of course, Erik will like anything that would solve the problem that he has, which is to end the molestation. And for years, he has let his brother be a spokesperson because Lyle was the more respected and regarded one in the family. And so he is hoping, although he's very apprehensive about it because he has a much better picture of Jose as a pervert than Lyle does, he is the one it's being done to. For Lyle, it's an idea at this point that stopped in his life when he was about 8. For Erik, it is a way of life. In any event, what's resolved Tuesday is that Lyle is going to have this discussion with Dad on Thursday. And what happens on Wednesday is very unfortunate because Lyle unfortunately tells Mom, and Lyle testified about this because Erik didn't know this, but Lyle testifies that on Wednesday he tells Mom that he wants to talk to Dad when Dad gets home, and unfortunately he lets Mom know the general subject matter. Now, Erik and Lyle go to lunch on Wednesday, and during the course of that lunch, Lyle tells Erik that he had mentioned to their mother that he wanted to talk to Father when Father got home, but Lyle doesn't tell Erik that he told Mother the subject matter, and Erik doesn't know that, and Erik is concerned about that. Erik says he said to Lyle, hope he didn't tell Mother, why you want to talk to Dad. Oh no, says Lyle. All right, so Thursday. Now, Erik testifies about Thursday that his recollection is he had a partial tennis lesson with Mark Heffernan that morning. He says what he remembers about that lesson is that he didn't feel up to completing it, and he sort of cut it short. Now, Mr. Kuriyama makes a big deal over whether or not there was a tennis lesson with Mark Heffernan Friday morning, and I submit to you, I don't think it makes the slightest bit of difference whether the tennis lesson was Thursday morning or Friday morning. Erik believes it was Thursday. Mark says, he's never said I'm sure. He said, I believe it's Friday. He really can't know because he doesn't have his calendar. He doesn't have his schedule. The reason he thinks it was Friday is because he believes when he asked about play on the weekend that he was told, we can't play with you tomorrow because we're going on a boat trip. But it could have also been we can't play with you Saturday because we're going on a boat trip. But the fact of the matter is he could have had this truncated tennis lesson with Mark Friday morning because what he definitely remembers and what Lyle definitely remembers is that he is on the tennis court Friday morning when Lyle wakes up. Okay, but now we're back to Thursday, before the fat is in the fire, if you will. So Erik's recollection is he played with his coach Mark Heffernan Thursday morning, that his father is due home from the business trip sometime that evening. And his recollection is that his father was originally due home at 6 o'clock, but that the flight keeps getting delayed over and over and over again. He leaves the house at some point, Erik, and he stays away. He calls in. See, he's very afraid of what he knows his father. He knows his father's violence more than Lyle does. He knows his father's negativity more than Lyle does. He's been the butt of it for years. And he's afraid. And he's been a bit of a coward also, Erik. He hasn't told Lyle everything, including all the violent things, because he's afraid that if he tells Lyle really how bad it was with Dad, Lyle will get cold feet, and he won't help him, and he has no other resource, and he doesn't want Lyle to say, well, more than I can handle, buddy. He wants him to do something. He wants to believe that his big brother can get him out of this mess. All right, anyway, he calls in periodically. He finds out that Dad's going to be home later and later and later and later. And so he gets home, and the first information he gets about how the talk went is when his father shows up at his room. Now, again, the prosecution makes a big deal over nothing. which is his father bangs on his bedroom door, and Flor didn't hear it. Well, this is about midnight. Maybe Flor's asleep. Maybe she's a heavy sleeper. Maybe she doesn't wake up every time someone on the other side of an 8,000 square foot house, or an 11th, huge, this place. When someone bangs on the door a couple of times, she doesn't spring to her feet and run upstairs to see what the masters are up to. I mean, it is ridiculous to keep saying these things couldn't have happened because Mrs. Surya didn't hear it. I mean, she's off in her room, and she's minding her own business, and it's the middle of the night. I mean, how many of the neighbors didn't even hear the shotguns going off in the middle of the night? I mean, much earlier at night. Okay. His father comes out there, bangs on the door, Erik opens the door. And that's how he learns from his father's accusations and his father's threats that Lyle has not only talked to him about stopping this behavior and allowing Erik to go, but that Lyle has clearly said something that now has convinced Jose that Lyle is going to tell. Now, that wasn't part of Erik's plan. I mean, Erik never wanted Lyle to go in there and threaten their father. He just wanted him to say, I want this to stop. This is what I would like to have happen. But it's very clear from Jose Menendez's reaction. And in fact, he says to Erik, Lyle's going to tell, and Erik says, no, he won't, and Jose says, yes, he will. And Jose gets physical with Erik, and he tries to grab him, and Erik runs out. Now, this is very dramatic sounding testimony. I know that. But these are very extreme people. They do very dramatic things, both the parents and the children in this family. You have heard example after example of very extreme behavior by Jose and Kitty Menendez, and very extreme words. And so this is of a piece with who these people were. This is no different than letting a child jump off the counter and then going, told you so. This kind of confrontational behavior is no different than that. And Erik goes downstairs. And now remember, his mother has known that this crisis is coming. This isn't, oh, he then accidentally runs into his mother, and oh, he accidentally runs into his brother. The parents are in collusion here, because when Jose comes back from the business trip, Lyle says it's clear, he knows that Lyle wants to have a talk with him, and he knows the topic, and he keeps Lyle waiting for 45 minutes. I'll be right down, I'm going upstairs to change my clothes, he says Thursday night, but he keeps Lyle waiting for 45 minutes, and then he comes down to listen to his son. And they're both in on this, and I mean, because Kitty was told what the subject would be, and she's up there for 45 minutes with Jose, figuring out what strategy are we going to use to keep these kids in our fist and to control them so that this thing doesn't get out. And the strategy is the same one as always: anger and fear and terrorizing. God forbid anybody in this family should ever talk. Okay, how should we deal with this? Oh no, parents rule, children follow, that's the law. So, after Jose does his part, Erik sees his mother, who's downstairs in the TV room, no doubt wanting to find out what's cooking, okay? And she knows what's been going on, because at this point, we don't really know how long after the talk between Lyle, Erik gets home, how much time has passed between that talk, where I'm sure Kitty and Jose have talked to each other about what it was Lyle said and what it was Jose said to keep Lyle under control. But they are clearly in communication with each other. And therefore, that's why when Erik comes through the family room on his way to the guest house, Kitty knows exactly what is going on, okay? And Erik is crying, and Erik is hysterical, and when she says, what's wrong with you? And he says to her, you wouldn't understand. Oh, she knows exactly what is on the agenda. She knows exactly what is going on in the family that night. And she says to him, of course I would. What do you think, I'm stupid? I know, I've always known. Because the kids have now, why is she willing to say this? Why is she that angry to throw it in his face? Because the kids have threatened her entire world. Because Lyle has threatened Jose that he may go public. And that is the thing that is nearest and dearest her heart, is her status, is the public perception. I'm not just talking about a person whose status conscious is material. I'm talking about a very insecure person, if you want to know the truth, for who this false image of herself is her only image of herself, and it's critically important to her. And she has spent her whole life putting out this false picture, hiding the truth at all costs, and she's not about to let the kids go public. And she is so upset that this threat has now entered her life that she is willing to throw it in Erik's face. She's willing to say something truthful inside this family, which happens so rarely. And so she lets Erik know. Yeah, she's known. This is no big surprise to her, but it is the end of his conception of the universe for Erik. Because no matter what she ever did to him, because no matter what she ever denied him, he loved his mother. You had to love your mother in that family, because you couldn't possibly kid yourself into thinking that your father loved you, but you could kid yourself, if you tried real hard, and he did, into thinking that his mother loved him. After all, she didn't do as many affirmatively horrible things to him, and it was very important to him to think that his mother loved him. And he needed somebody to love, so he loved her, and he liked it when she smiled. That was what he looked for in life. And now he finds out. He's always known she couldn't help him. He thought it was because she's a victim herself. He's always known she didn't help him. And he used to tell himself, she doesn't know. If my mommy knew, she'd come, wouldn't she? And now he knows she knew, and she didn't come, and she didn't care. And that is a devastating blow. And what that really does, that I think this is the one thing I really can feel. I can't be Erik. I've tried, but it's hard. I can't be Erik, but one thing I can feel is your mother turning into a Martian before your very eyes. Wherever she was, he thought he knew her. Imagine your mother turning into an alien creature. How frightening that has to be. I don't know this person. And if the one thing you know about this person is she's going to protect her life at all costs, and she is now a Martian. She isn't even my earthling mother. All bets are off. This is a terrifying person. Everything else, buying guns, saying somebody's going to get killed, threatening to poison the family, wanting to kill herself, being brutal to them, all those things, yes, build up and make her a scary person. But that is the single scariest. I don't even know her. And she can therefore do anything. And that's why they are as frightened, and particularly Erik, as frightened, if not more so, by his mother, because his entire idea of her is blown. As by the father, at least whose brutality is, whose attitudes are known. They know what he's going to do. She's always been the unpredictable one. She's always been the unsettling one. And that only multiplies tenfold that Thursday night. And so he goes back and he has the conversations with his brother. What should we do? What should we do? And I've described to you, what some of those considerations were and why, in fact, when we talk about the involuntary manslaughter instruction and the imperfect self-defense, because of the way you're going to be instructed, we don't have to show more than unreasonableness. But so much of what their feelings were based on perfectly reasonable assumptions, given this family, okay? Given this history. And their entire discussion about why they can't get away and why they have no options is dead right. There is nothing unreasonable in thinking that with these parents and with their power and their money and their abilities and their smarts and their secretiveness all these years, that there is no way that you're going to be able to go to the police at 18 and convince them to do anything. And there's no way you're going to convince sweet
That's what I've been saying. Jose is so well connected. He's connected with Hollywood and the music industry, and he's got money and the ability to pay for things, really expensive things that most people wouldn't do for free because they're illegal. So, he could easily do something to hurt the boys and the boys' lives, whatever. Like he could orchestrate some kind of kidnapping type of thing and then never hear from them again or whatever. Like he really legit had money, connections, he knew people. I don't want to get into this whole thing right now, but if you do some research into, what we're finding out now about Diddy and the guy before him, Jeff, that I don't think you can say his last name on YouTube without getting struck. Epstein. Um, with him and Diddy, they're not the only ones, and they learned it from somebody. There there are multiple honeypots that are out there, I think, that are controlling the celebrities, making the celebrities say whatever they want. The politicians are controlling them. Um, and I don't want to get any further in that, but just do some research into that, and you'll see that there are honeypots of, these trafficking groups that SA children and harm children, and it's all coming to light now. And celebrities that everyday household names that are most likely all going to disappoint you. Just saying. So it's all going to come out eventually. And Diddy's just the beginning. And, well, Epstein was just the beginning, and now Diddy. And there's more. So, that's all I want to say on that. You guys do your own research on it and let me know what you think. There's a lot of symbolism, a lot of symbolism within artists and how they portray themselves in their photo shoots and things, and a lot of symbolism that leads us to believe, if you follow the clues, that the celebrities and politicians are basically the ones that are controlling all the money. Well, people control money above them, but the people with the money are controlling the celebrities and the politicians. So that's all I want to say about that before my channel gets struck forever and demonetized. So just look into it.
Aunt Terry and dear Uncle Carlos and tough Aunt Martha or anybody. You're never going to convince anybody. These kids don't believe they're ever going to be believed anyway. And so often they're not when they should be. And then they come to trial like Erik has. And here I stand 2 days in the running, still trying to get you to believe him. I mean, and that's the hurdle they're really operating under. And they certainly knew that night. Who's going to believe worthless me when great dad is being accused? Nobody. Because I'm just a piece of garbage. Hasn't he told me that all my life? So what are their options? And their options runs the gamut of the extreme emotionalism that was created in this child, I submit to you, from the day he was born. They are terrified and they think survival. And that's what you're going to get with a child who's raised in this kind of environment. He is going to be that frightened, and he is going to think survival. And so they make a decision, and there is a decision in this case. And I think that's what the constant confusion with the Ozeal information is, because indeed they do make a decision. They make the same decision I talked about the other day. They make the decision to buy the gun to stop the burglar, and it looks like a plan. But it is just a decision. It's not a plan to kill, it's a plan to defend yourself. There was no other way to do it unless they wanted to wait for an opportune moment to go into their mother's closet and steal her rifles and hope they didn't notice it. There was nothing else they could do at that point but go and buy something to protect themselves with. And that's the Thursday night discussion where they decide to do that. And then comes Friday morning, and hope springs eternal, and Erik looks out and it's a sunny day, and he doesn't want to deal with this. He's been an avoider anyway. That's one of his coping strategies. You don't think about the bad stuff if you don't have to. You dissociate. You try not to remember. You put it out of your mind. He talked about what happened during a very painful episode. He just tried to take his mind away. And now it's Friday morning, and it's Beverly Hills, it's California. Did you ever notice, by the way, as an aside, how difficult it is to stay melancholy in Southern California because it never rains enough? And you wake up and you're sort of feeling blue, and the sun is out there, and it's going to pull you out. And so here's Erik, who's been afraid the night before, and he's been up most of the night before, and he's been nightmaring since Tuesday, which is classic in his life. And he wants to think, no, there's no real problem. And Lyle, who to Erik is the voice of wisdom, even though we know he has terrible judgment, but there's Lyle saying, no, this is real, Erik. Remember, I have threatened our father with exposure, and there is no way they are going to let us live. And so he reignites, if you will, the fear, and they go and they buy the guns. Now, I'm not going to go back over the entire course of what they did, because I'm tired, and because you heard it, and because it's been argued to you a lot. But the bottom line is, he ultimately testifies to going to 3 different gun stores that day, and there is nothing particularly to his advantage in saying that. Clearly, he knew there was a 2-week waiting period for handguns, or they would have bought handguns, folks, because that makes the most sense. That's the planned crime. That's the prosecution's theory. And even to defend themselves, even more particularly to defend themselves, you would want handguns, wouldn't you? It's kind of hard to defend yourself if you're walking around with a shotgun in your pocket. If you're afraid that people are going to jump on you, it's sort of hard to tuck that shotgun in. Whereas it's real easy if you're afraid of other people to tuck in a handgun. And that's why it makes perfect sense that they would have wanted a handgun and couldn't get one because there is a 2-week waiting period, and did learn that somewhere along the line. And that's important because they clearly are in haste. And that's important because they'd have no reason to be in haste if this was a killing to end control. The only reason to be acting in haste is because they're afraid.
Whoops. Okay. So that's the end of that video, but we're going to hop into another day and just keep on tracking from here. So
Christmas is coming. Yesterday I was in the middle of a discussion about the events immediately preceding the shooting of Mr. and Mrs. Menendez. Now, I am not going to go through all of these facts for the simple reason that when it came to describing these events, Erik was cross-examined repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. And so there was a great deal of testimony and going over these events when he testified, and I don't think I need to remind you of that by repeating it all now. But what I am going to focus on are what were the significant events that kept the level of fear that had started on Tuesday and reached its height prior to Friday, Thursday night. And what was it that the parents did or didn't do that maintained and escalated that level of fear in this child of theirs that they had created with fear? Now, we were talking yesterday about that point when Erik is in the den or the family room, and his mother, who clearly knew in advance that there was going to be a confrontation, first with Lyle and then with Erik, admits to him that she knows and has known all along what's going on. Now, the prosecution tries to use the fact that this family has a maid to impeach the credibility of Erik and Lyle on some of the issues in the case. And here, for example, Mr. Kuriyama has already argued, and I suspect will argue again, that the maid didn't testify that she heard any yelling from this den. Yeah, but Erik didn't testify that there was any yelling at that point. He exchanged a few words with his mother. The only time he raised his voice is when he said to her, "I hate you." He was so shocked by her betrayal, and he ran out the door. But Mr. Slotkin testified that that particular room in the house, that family room, was soundproofed on purpose when the house was built. And when the Menendezes moved in, they put in bookcases that you can see from the photograph that I showed you yesterday that has all the boys' trophies along the top. And this is, by now, like the middle of the night. This is after midnight, because Mr. Menendez has come home very, very late that night. So I don't see any value whatsoever in the notion that the maid didn't hear Erik say, "I hate you." And then he ran out. And Lyle testified he could hear his mother screaming at Erik as they were right below the stairs at the guest house. And that's when he heard sounds from outside that attracted his attention to the stairs. Now, I had mentioned to you yesterday that if you analyze what went on in this family over that last summer, from this perspective of what are the parents doing here, it appears that they had declared war. The laboratory experiment had not succeeded in the way they hoped, and their behavior during this last week appears to be a declaration of war against their children. And this is what Mrs. Menendez says to Erik in that family room, is as bold a declaration of war as you can imagine. I mean, to tell him, guess what, I know, and I didn't care. It cannot get worse in a parent-child relationship than for a mother to tell that to her son. And the fact that she would do such a cruel thing is not out of context or out of character for her. Because Tuesday, that argument with Lyle, we don't know exactly what it was about, except that it was about his hairpiece. I mean, and is that an appropriate thing to do with your son, to tear off his hairpiece? Let's say she's angry with him over something, or she doesn't want him to have a hairpiece. It is a sadistic thing to do. There are many ways to punish a child for whatever the sin is that she's punishing Lyle for. And you've heard about all the things that they were doing for him. They're buying him a condominium. He's going back to Princeton. I mean, there hasn't been any testimony in this case, but you can imagine what it costs to put a kid in an Ivy League school. He has this humongous credit card that he can use. I don't mean the phone credit card, I mean the one he bought the Rolex watches with. So if you're trying to punish him, there are lots of things you could cut him off of, but to rip this thing off, to attack his sense of self-worth, to attack his soul again, and that is how these people attack their children, in their heart and in their soul and in their sense of self-worth. We're not talking about normal parenting here. We're not talking about taking away privileges. We're talking about destroying the person, attacking their ego and their sense of themselves. Now, Erik has testified that when his mother admits what she knew, and he has this overwhelming sense of betrayal, he said, I thought I didn't know her. I didn't know who she was, and it was very scary. And I talked yesterday about how you would get the sense that your parent is not at all the person you thought they were. Whatever you thought of her, she is like an alien now. But there were other things happening in this family that made this mother a very unsettling figure to her children. And I'm not even talking about that whole long history of her emotional and mental problems. I'm simply talking about behaviors that had no explanation, because this is a family where nobody ever shares anything with anybody. Erik testified that after his parents were dead, he discovered a tape recording device. And in fact, we put it in evidence, the hookup device, so that his mother, his parents were spying on all of his and Lyle's phone calls. They had this hookup for his phone. Now, that's a normal response of a parent of a teenager, is to spy on all of their phone calls. And he also testified that all of his diaries kept disappearing. That's a nice, appropriate parental tactic, steal your child's diaries. This shows respect for them as human beings. But beyond that, Erik said he had this sense that his mother had some kind of superhuman or magical power, because she knows everything. Well, she's reading his diaries, she's listening in on the phone, but he doesn't know that at the time. She knows when he doesn't want to tell her exactly who he's playing tennis with, or what girls he's met, or who he's going out with. She knows it anyway, and he can't figure out how. Now, you may say, oh, it's not reasonable for him not to have figured out how. But this is a child who was raised by a man, for example, who thinks that because he has his genes, he should be able to speak Spanish. There's a lot of very fantastical thinking that goes on in this family over the entire life of this child. So it is not out of context that his mother seems to have this uncanny ability to know what he's doing. And that makes her scary as well, besides all the specific things. And he said that he believed that his mother would kill them because she hated them. And she and Dad were a team. And he said she must have hated me for her to have known all those years. And I want to address briefly this notion, which is a completely accurate one, I think, that Erik had, a totally reasonable one, that his mother and father were a team. Excuse me. They had a joint style and a joint philosophy of child rearing. And that style and philosophy was that their children were not human beings to treasure and to love and to support and to appreciate for who they are, but they were objects to use for their own purposes. Their purposes of sexual pleasure, of sadistic pleasure, they loved to frighten them together, to vent their frustration and anger on. And that was mainly Mrs. Menendez's use for these kids, to manipulate them and direct them and control them. For what purpose? Because they wanted the best for them, or for their own self-aggrandizement, for the trophies. And this is regardless of how the children feel, regardless of what the children want. And they are joint in this. And this is the pattern of his entire life. So during this last week, there is no reason for him to believe that they are now of two minds when they have always been of one. But more important, it is clear in the way that this family was organized that Mrs. Menendez was within the circle of the father's approval from what the children could see, because she is totally loyal to him. My mother would never go against Dad, and there isn't a soul in the world who could.
I just want to point out, I think she's doing an excellent job bringing home the fact that mom is abusive too. She had every part of it, and she was a willing participant. And now look at them together. They were a team. It was them versus the brothers. And it took a while for the boys to even bond, because they weren't supposed to talk to one another, and they put this like competition in their heads, like they're supposed to compete against one another. So they didn't always share everything in the house. So yeah. But anyways, my point was, it was the parents versus the boys, and she's doing a really good job, I think, of trying to bring that home by pointing out that mom's not innocent. And I want to point out that I am wrong. In the very beginning, when we started watching these and didn't know everything about Kitty, I too thought, well, maybe she's just a victim of her circumstances. She's the victim of abuse from Jose, yada, yada, yada. Well, no. After everything that's come out, all of the evidence, I absolutely firmly believe she was complicit in the abuse. She contributed to it. She aided and abetted it. and she's just as guilty as Jose.
Come in here and testify that she would ever go against him on behalf of the children in any way. And he, as the kind of power-oriented person he was, certainly would not tolerate any force standing between him and his sense of ownership of these children. And I think, too, when you hear the stories about how she makes up ways for the children to get in trouble so that she won't, it's clear that her position was that Jose was going to vent, if he was going to vent his sadism, better on them than on her. And this is the pattern of their whole life. And it gets worse for the children's sake after they're in California. Because even though she's unhappy and she's miserable and he's done her wrong, this doesn't, I mean, there's those first few months, the months in which the sex stopped, there's those first few months, but after that, they are closer than ever. And everyone comments on how different their relationship is. Now, I have suggested to you that she has a threat that she's holding over him. But beyond that, how it appears to Erik is that his parents are one moon unit. There is no differentiation between them now at all. Because and her loyalty to Jose, in view of the fact that he'd done her wrong, has got to convince Erik that she believes in everything he's doing. Because you would say, wait a minute, Dad was bad to her, therefore she should be mad at him, therefore she shouldn't be going along with everything. But the fact that she goes along with it even more would tell the child, well, she agrees with these things. She may have her personal differences with him, but when it comes to us, they are totally of one mind. And so all the threats that Jose ever made to Erik about killing him are equally ascribable to Kitty in this time of crisis, when she clearly takes no part other than Jose's part, which the children understand is her position as well. Okay, so this is the confrontation that Erik has with his mother Thursday, and then he goes up and he has this long talk with his brother, and the decision is made that they should do something to protect themselves, because they cannot conceive that these people would ever allow them to be free of them with this secret, would ever allow them to tell anybody. Now, you've heard a great deal about all the gun stores and buying the guns and the ID and all the rest of that. What's significant, though, in this course of the fear is the Friday night conversation when they come back. And this is where they have the conversation where their mother tells them that the time of the boat trip has changed. And so if you think about the fear over the course of that week, it has moments when it's very high, like Thursday night, and then Friday morning when the sun is shining, it comes down a little bit, but then it skyrockets right back up again. And never do the parents do anything that settles or resolves the issue or takes away the threat that this crisis poses to the children. The fear never ever goes down to ground zero again. And Dr. Burgess talked about what happens over a course of days with someone like Erik, who has been raised on fear, who is extremely sensitive and hypervigilant to fear, and how he stays up at that elevated level all the time. Now, the thing about the boat trip is very interesting. The very fact that they went on it. The prosecution, I think, would argue that they're separated from their parents because they're up in the front of the boat getting soaking wet, conspiring. But that's ridiculous. I mean, if they're really planning to kill their parents, then why are they going on the boat trip at all? They could use their time better in creating real alibis rather than this patched up job that they came up with after the shootings. So why are they there? They testify they go because they don't want to do anything that will precipitate action on the part of their parents. And I think the other reality is they go because they do what they're told. There's a family boat trip, they're supposed to go on it, they go. They do what they're told, just like they always have. Now, after the boat trip, when nothing happens, in a sense, the fear level drops a tiny bit at that point, and there are a series of conversations between Erik and Lyle. But what's most significant is they go back home after talking at UCLA about what they should do the next day to stay away from the parents and to protect themselves. And then they have this argument with their mother when they're trying to get back in the house. And during the course of this argument, she flat out accuses Erik that, in her typical fashion, and this is not out of character for her, that if he had kept his mouth shut, obvious reference to talking about the molestation, things would have worked out in the family. And what that tells Erik is, Mom is definitely hostile to us, wants to kill us. Things have not worked out. Well, these kids know if things are not going to work out, it's for them that it's not going to work out, not for the parents, that the parents are going to protect themselves from the threat that the children pose with their secret. And so he tells you that made it clear to him that both parents were resolved, that they had made up their mind, and that they were going to kill them. Now, we talk about these things, and none of us were there, and none of us lived the life that he lived. And you say to yourself, oh, that doesn't make sense. Oh, that's not reasonable. And all I can remind you of is two things. Number one, I'll get back to the law in a minute, that they don't have to be reasonable in order for the law of manslaughter to apply. That's part one. But the other part is, when you look at the whole pattern of behavior of these parents over the lives of these children, how unreasonable is it really to think that people who were this brutal and cruel to their children are incapable of killing them to protect themselves? I mean, you really have to say, is it unreasonable? Well, okay, it doesn't have to be reasonable for the law to apply. But is it totally fantastic, given the history of this family? Now Erik is gone all day long on Sunday, and Lyle is supposed to assess the situation. And we put on a lot of expert testimony about how frightened people who have been conditioned by fear, scan their environment. I mean, we did that from the very beginning with Dr. Briere, in the hopes that you would then have some kind of framework for the rest of the evidence as it came in. And Dr. Briere is not personally involved with Erik. He's never talked to him. He was just here to explain general patterns, consistent patterns that happen in situations where people in power are abusing and battering people who are not in power within a family context. And he told you that this classic pattern of hypervigilance and heightened fear is a symptom of abused kids, just like it is a symptom of battered wives. And so what these folks do is they scan their environment for cues and for clues. And you might remember even on the tape of 1211, Lyle makes a reference to a word here and a word there. And these things have great meaning to a person who is watching to see if a threat is going to be actualized. Even though this word here and this word there wouldn't mean anything to us. And what's so strange about this family, what's so tragic about all this, I mean, this is, there are no winners and losers in this, ever. There are only all losers. But what's so tragic about this is here are two articulate, intelligent, well-educated people, Mr. and Mrs. Menendez, with talents and abilities. I mean, he is a genius when it comes to business. He is clever. He's got a great way with words. She is a well-educated person. She was a school teacher. She is articulate. She is bright. And they cannot and will not talk. They will not talk to their children. They will not negotiate with them in any way, shape, or form. They will never give an inch. It is always going to be ultimate confrontation. And this entire situation could have been avoided with a word or two. How about, I'm sorry? How about, I'll stop? How about, we'll work on it? Anything. But no. They are so totally locked into themselves and what they want out of life and what they want out of the family. And they are so locked into the notion that their children are not people, that they are only a part of them and they don't have to be dealt with that way, that this thing ratchets into this monumental tragedy. And Sunday night starts this exchange where the brothers decide they want to leave and they want to stay away. And they go in order not to alarm the parents and tell them we're going out now, and they're told they can't go out. And their mother is acting very peculiarly because she won't give them a reason. Because there is no good reason why they can't go out. There's no school. It's summertime. They don't have to be anywhere. There's no reason why they can't stay out late. And they haven't done anything over the course of the day to be punished about. So it makes no sense when they're told they can't go out and they have to be there. And then starts the argument where it is clear to Erik and Lyle that Jose is sending Erik to his room for a very ugly purpose. And that these parents are now at the verge of making good on their lifelong threats. Now, it might not seem that way to us, but it seemed that way to them. And what happens at this point, I mean, you can analyze this, you can try to analyze it logically, you can try to analyze it scientifically, but human emotions are not really measurable that way. And Mr. Kuriyama and Mrs. Bazanich, too, when she was cross-examining, have been very derisive about the research that Dr. Burgess talked about, where there was research done on a type of snail in order to see if you could actually see, under a microscope, in a testing situation, a change in a brain brought about by trauma. That's what that research was about. And we do not do research like that on people. We do not cut open their brains. We don't traumatize them first and then cut open their brains to see if we can see physiological changes. We do that kind of research in a scientific setting on lower organisms than human beings. And as you know, there's a lot of people who think we don't do them on organisms low enough. There's animal rights people who are very upset about experimenting on animals in laboratories. But all she's talking about is the fact that current neurobiological research is confirming with physical evidence that traumatized organisms have a rewiring in their brain. And whether that's a biological reality or the psychological reality that those who have studied traumatized people have known about for years, the fact of the matter is there is a point, if you have been traumatized most of your life, when you go over the edge, period. And that is what happened that Sunday night to Erik Menendez. He had been living with this fear. It kept getting higher. The cues and the clues that he saw based on his whole relationship with his parents told him, they're going to kill me now. And he was terrified. And he went over the edge. Now, we can talk about it in the terms that Dr. Burgess did about the fight and flight response, which is automatic, which does not involve the cerebral cortex, which is the part of the brain that does rational and logical and deliberative kind of thinking. And she described it in a sense as automatic pilot, which is not a scientific term, but it conveys the same meaning. But the point is, if you think about it, if you're driving down the street and a truck cuts you off, okay? You hit the brake, you hit the steering wheel long before you don't have to think about hitting the brake. You don't think I intend to hit the steering wheel. You just do it. And it is only after the truck has passed and look, you didn't get hit and you're not dead, that you start to process what just happened. What just happened? The truck came from here and I did that. Gee, I don't even remember hitting the brake. And your heart starts to calm down a little bit. And that is the classic fear reaction, and that is the classic automatic movement. Well, it doesn't only take place over the space of a few seconds, as in a near accident. It takes place as well during any highly fearful, traumatic episode, which is what's going on in this house that Sunday night. And here's the other aspect of tragedy here, that this fear at this point is not rationally developed, is not thought about, it simply takes over, and it is uncontrollable. There is nothing, when you are in that mode as a person, that you can do or say to your body to say, stop reacting with fear. Don't react with fear. It's going to do it. You have no control over it. And the tragic part is, just to go back to my analogy of the scientific experiment, the laboratory way of raising these children. Control was the key to how Jose and Kitty Menendez raised their children. They probably thought they could do anything they wanted to them, and so long as they were perceived as the powerful ones, they could control the outcome. But the kids themselves couldn't control the fear. It got out of control, and this was something I don't think either Mr. or Mrs. Menendez ever anticipated, that if you terrorize a person so much, they're not going to be able to cope with it forever. And all their coping strategies and all their coping mechanisms that Erik developed over all these years simply left him when survival was on the line. And he couldn't control it, and the parents couldn't control it. And by maintaining this wall of silence and rejection that whole weekend, they lost control over Erik forever. They couldn't, if they had just reeled him in with any comforting or supporting talk of any kind, that fear would have disappeared. But they were going to play it power to the end. And in the end, they lost control over a situation that they created. It's as if in this laboratory, they had taken hydrogen and chloride and poured them in a dish and created hydrochloric acid and got burned. The acid didn't ask to be created. He did not ask to be born to these people. He did not ask them to treat him that way. He did not ask them to hypersensitize him to fear. They did that on their own, and the experiment got out of control by their doing. Now, am I blaming the victims? No. I am understanding what happened, and that's what I'm asking you to do. The interesting thing, too, that Erik testified to about when he rushes to get his gun and they've loaded the gun out by the car, is what was the only thing that was going on in his mind was hurry up, hurry up. He's got to get to that room before they get to him first. And he says that based on his entire experience of confrontation with these parents, he knows that if he's actually confronted with them, and he believes, remember, at that point, that they have to be arming themselves in some way, that he would have been frozen. He would never, and he never was able to have a direct confrontation with them. We have 2 words, shut up, over the entire course of his life. And he felt, rightly so, that he would never have been able to defend himself at that moment, that once they were in operation, right in front of his eyes, he would have been frozen, like the bunny on the highway with the headlights on. And then he talked about what actually went on inside the den during the shooting. And he was cross-examined repeatedly over and over. Well, what did you do? What did you see? And he says, and it isn't hard to understand, he doesn't remember doing anything but firing the gun right ahead, because he didn't do anything but that. He walked into a darkened room. He starts firing a gun that produces a great deal of smoke. All he remembers is running, and he remembers where he wound up, and he remembers firing right in front of him. And he doesn't remember any thinking at that time, because as we know, this is not a time when you do any thinking of any kind. And that's it. What else should he remember? What was on television? What was on the coffee table? No. That he blew 2 rounds through the back window? No. You wouldn't expect to remember that if you're doing this in that state. Suppose if you're a cold enough and calculating enough killer, you will watch to see where each of the 27 pellets from the buckshot round goes. Of course, you couldn't possibly see that anyway. You can't really see that happening, even if you are looking to see it, and I think it's clear he wasn't. Now, what he did testify to about what he remembers seeing when he first got in the room was that his father was standing up in front of that portion of the couch that was beyond the coffee table, and that his mother was standing between the couch and the coffee table. I'm putting up a crime scene photograph of Mr. Menendez's legs. Now, I will deal a little bit later with Mr. Signorelli's testimony and the facts that the prosecution are relying on. He's here for one tiny little purpose, and I will get to that. But Mr. Kuriyama reminded you that part of his testimony was that Erik supposedly told him on the 1st of September that when he entered the room, his father was seated on the couch. And I believe the prosecution wants to argue, indeed, that that was true, that Mr. Menendez was shot on the couch, and that he is in the position in these photographs that he was in throughout the course of the shooting. And I will tell you flat out that isn't true. Not only could they not prove that, but they proved the opposite of that. There is some physical evidence in this case that is not ambiguous, and the evidence from the coroner and the evidence of your own eyes here is not ambiguous. And here's the point. This is the left thigh injury, and this is an arrow that the coroner, I believe, drew on this photograph, which shows the direction of this shot. This is the entrance wound. This is the exit wound. It goes from inside the top of his left thigh to outside the top of his left thigh. And there's the direction of the shot. And he could not have been sitting when he received it, because you can't tell from this photograph. You can tell somewhat from this photograph, but it's a through and through wound. The pellets pass through completely. There is no blood splatter here. There is no blood splatter on this side of the couch at all. And if something goes through there, there would be. There has to be. The blood splatter and or the pellets, if they come out, on this side, in this area. And there is absolutely nothing there. So the coroner...
I keep muting myself because my dogs pace and they're so loud. So she just proved that the parents were standing, and or did she? Did she prove that the parents were standing? I think so. There would be spatter on the couch. Absolutely. And it would make more sense if he was like in a walking position that he got, if he was like standing and coming at them, that it would do that. It makes more sense to me.
Testified, no, he could not have been in that position at the time that that wound was inflicted. But that wound is consistent with his standing up. And if you look at the other crime scene photographs, and you will have them all, what is most consistent, the explanation for what position he was in, is if you look at the couch behind him, there's a tremendous amount of blood there, and Detective Zoller testified they did not attempt to dig pellets out of the couch. So there is this very bloody area in the couch that potentially holds pellets. But if Mr. Menendez, see, this is the couch. If Mr. Menendez was standing in such a way as this, and was shot in this direction, then the back of the couch, the seat of the couch where all the blood is, would have the spray from that wound and the pellets from that wound. And that is the only place, and you just look at the photographs, without the bodies on them, they're not as gruesome. Just look at the photograph on the couch, and you will see that it is impossible for him to be seated in order to receive that wound, to be seated in any way to receive that wound. Beyond that, he also has wounds to the back of his arm, okay, and I believe it's the right arm. And the coroner testified he could not possibly have received those wounds to the back of his arm if he was in the position that he's in, because you would have had to shoot right through the couch. And he would have seen evidence of that. First of all, you'd have to go completely around the couch and shoot behind the couch to get those wounds in his arm. And there was no evidence from the pellets. They didn't pick up any fibers or anything like that in those wounds. So clearly, he was in a completely different position when he received both the leg wound and when he received the wound to his arm. And what's consistent with those wounds is that he was standing up and he was moving. And you may recall Lyle testified that he saw his father moving towards him, which is consistent with what I have shown you, where the evidence of that wound would be on the seat of the couch or on the back of the couch.
I don't know what I said. I was muted. I said something about he definitely didn't get those injuries from sitting, and it was just luck that he happened to land on the couch and make it look like he was sitting. Do you know what I mean? It was just like perfect timing and positioning, I think.
Now, much has been made by the prosecution about this route that was taken after the shootings, what Erik testified. Well, no, much has been made about what Lyle testified to. And one of the things that was done here, and I talked about this earlier, is the prosecution simply selects those bits and pieces from the defense case that they like and ignore the rest. And they didn't just select, they did an entire elaborate driving route based on what they say was Lyle's testimony only, and they didn't even do a driving route based on what Erik testified to. And I just think that's intellectually dishonest. And then Mr. Kuriyama gets up here and talks about, well, Lyle said they stayed 5 to 10 minutes and blah, blah, blah. Well, the fact is Erik didn't testify that way. Erik's memory was different. And the memory of someone after a trauma like this, as to time, is probably the least reliable thing for anyone to base a decision on. But the fact of the matter is, this is Erik's trial, and Erik testified that in his recollection, they remained in the house only 3 to 4 minutes after the shooting occurred. And they didn't take long at all to pick up the shells in the family room, and he pointed out why, because they were all in one general area and they didn't have to go hunting around to find them. And the times that Miss Erdely put on the charts, and you will have the charts, not the big ones, but the small versions of the charts in the jury room, are not what I told her to do arbitrarily, or what she figured out to do arbitrarily. It's what Erik testified to. And every segment of that trip, the time for activities, is what he testified to. And she drove it, and it was doable. Not only was it doable to do the drive in 50 minutes, it was absolutely doable to do all the activities he testified to in the time he said it took, and she did it 4 times, and for both routes. The reason we did 2 routes is in order to give a fully balanced picture, because Lyle testified that he thought they may have dumped the guns first. And so we did a route with dumping the guns first. And it turns out there isn't much differential in time, whether you dump the guns first or you go to the movie theater first, because Lyle's route didn't involve the freeway and Erik's route did involve the freeway. And when you factor those differences in, it comes out to be the same thing, 51 minutes. And so we sent someone out there who did a meticulous and carefully documented route. You have the videos. I can't imagine you're going to want to take 2 hours, because there's 2 different routes to play the video, but you've got all the time in the world. There's no limit on how long you can deliberate, except your own tolerance and patience. And so if you want to play the videos, I invite you to compare the video that Ms. Erdely made and carefully documented with the thing that Detective Zoller and his wife did. But the fact of the matter is, there's been no impeachment whatsoever of the activities after based on time or based on the route. Now I want to talk about Saturday morning and Mr. Walker. Erik testified that Saturday morning, he and his brother went off in search of, for him, an opportunity to try out the gun, which he never got, and for his brother, an inquiry about ammunition to make sure they had the right sort, and they bought more ammunition, and they bought it at the store in Van Nuys that Detective Zoller confirmed exists, and is exactly as Erik described it, a small little store with a target range across the street, an indoor target range, where they don't let you shoot off shotguns. And the people put on the volunteer, Mr. Walker. And I would like to suggest an analysis of Mr. Walker's testimony on a number of grounds. Okay. Now, I don't doubt that on some day, under some circumstance, Mr. Walker fixed the spa controls, or the pool controls, or both of them, if that's what he was hired to do. And he may even have done that work on August 19th, though there are no records of any kind, nor were they ever, to prove that. Nor did the prosecution put on any witness who said that at that time, right around the time, Mr. Walker said, gee, I was just there 2 days ago, okay? They did put on Mr. Bartek, and Mr. Bartek impeached Mr. Walker. And what I mean by that is Mr. Bartek said, yes, I told Mr. Walker to do this, and yes, Mr. Walker said he did this, and yes, I paid him, and maybe this is the check, and maybe this isn't the check that I paid him with. And yes, he told me his story about what he saw. And what was it that Mr. Walker told Mr. Bartek? He said that Mr. Walker told him he oversaw an argument. If I've got, Mr. Walker told 5 different versions, I want you to know. So I think the version that Mr. Bartek testified to was that Mr. Walker told him that he had seen the younger son having an argument with the father. Now that's the story that Mr. Walker at some point told Mr. Bartek, okay? But what he told you here, his testimony here was that Kitty and Jose and Erik Menendez were all around this table and chairs, which wasn't here, but here, between the tennis court fence and the pool. That's where he told us they were. And they were there, and there was no fence here at all. It was totally an open space, he said. And Lyle was on the tennis court with his coach, and Lyle was using foul language because he missed a shot, and he was in a fight with his mother. He was using the foul language of his mother. That's what he testified to here. On the radio, he said, Erik is on the tennis court having a fit because of the missed shot, using foul language, but he doesn't say that it's directed at anybody, mom or dad. And he says the parents, on the radio, he says the parents aren't saying anything. Okay? And then, of course, we know Bartek says the fight was between Erik and dad. And here he says the fight is between Lyle and mom. Now, this is not a hard, if this is true, this is not a very hard story to repeat. But what's interesting about it is many things. First of all, he says the coach is there. We know there's only one coach at this point in their lives, and that's Mark Heffernan. And we know Mark Heffernan isn't there specifically because Mark Heffernan says he knew they were going on the boat trip on Saturday, and he knew that definitely Saturday he wasn't giving them a tennis lesson, and he was expecting a call on Sunday. Maybe there'd be a lesson that day. Okay? So Mark, the coach, is definitely not there. So he's made that up. Okay? Now, he's also made up something that's contrary to the history of the family and contrary to what everybody knows. And that is that Kitty Menendez is not the one, when one of the boys is playing tennis, to make these comments on their play. And he is claiming, Mr. Walker, that what is going on is whichever brother it is, and whatever it is he's doing, because I don't know anything about tennis, I can't tell you. Well, did you tell the police that they missed a shot? Well, I don't know about missing a shot. I don't know anything about tennis, I can't tell you. And on the radio, he says, missed a shot. And in Detective Zoller's report is written, missed a shot. But here, well, I don't know enough about tennis to tell you if they missed a shot or not. Okay. All right, but my point is, Kitty is not the person to be commenting on how one of the boys plays. That's Jose's job, and that's what he's been doing all of their lives. And yet Mr. Walker tells us, Jose is silent. Kitty's the one making the comments. And now it's either Erik or Lyle, or the interchangeable people. It's one of them is now saying something foul back to Kitty. And I submit to you that none of that ever happened. Okay? And here's the clue to that it never happened. Mr. Walker, he didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to be here. He's not seeking publicity. He doesn't want his voice and his visage known. Oh no, he's only here. This is before we knew about the radio program, folks. He is only here because his wife, without his permission, went to the police department and told them that he knew something about this family. Now, when is it that Mr. Walker goes to the police? July 25th. When did this trial begin? I'm sure you all know only too well. And what did we talk about in opening statement? Our entire theory of the case. And who testified on July 21st? Bob Anderson, the boat captain, talking about how this family appears to him. And on July 25th, Mr. Walker goes and gives his little story to the police. What Mr. Walker also tells us, though, which is also a clue that he is not credible, is that since he saw this remarkable event, a teenage boy, or maybe a slightly older boy, since we don't know who, saying something rude to a parent, since he saw so remarkable an event, he called the Beverly Hills Police Department as soon as he heard they were dead. That's what he says. And he told Miss Erdely that when he called, he left his phone number. And here we have the desk person at the Beverly Hills Police Department. This is the biggest criminal investigation, as you can imagine, in the Beverly Hills Police Department's recent history. I mean, the only thing that even got anything like the coverage of this was Zsa Zsa slapping the cop. But this is a double homicide at home in the fair and perfect city of Beverly Hills. And here is a person calling in immediately saying, I have information on the Menendez case, and they don't want to talk to him. Because he says the person who answered the phone says, no, well, that's not important. We don't need to talk to you. And he tells Miss Erdely he leaves his phone number, and they never call him back. And Detective Zoller says there's no such message. So that's a clue that he's not telling you the truth. And the other clue that he's not telling you the truth is, when do you suppose this photograph was taken? Sunday. This is one of the crime scene photographs. And this one, too. When do you suppose these photographs? These are taken by the Beverly Hills Police Department. The next day, the table and chairs have miraculously migrated back in front of the guest house and are not where Mr. Walker claims they were. And as I said to you in the beginning, one of the really bad aspects to having a totally televised trial is the homework people can do to come in and make up stories. Now, there's another way to look at why Mr. Walker did this. You know, he's a person who lives an ordinary sort of life, and this was a big deal, the killing of the Menendez parents, and he serviced their pool. And you could see him saying, I service that pool. I know all about that. I know those people. In fact, I even saw them. And he may have been foolish enough to tell his wife, hey, you know, I serviced that spot. Well, did you see, were they home? Did you see them? Oh, yeah, they were there. Well, what did you see? Who knows when he first made up the story? Either to impress his wife, who clearly wanted the exposure of this trial since she went to the police department, or whether he told less, like I was there, and the details only fleshed out after we started this trial. We will never know. But the story is so out of context for what we know about this family, and it is so uncorroborated by the physical evidence that I just find it untrue. And beyond that, and most important, because you know the prosecution's whole theory is Erik Menendez has lied about every single thing he said on the witness stand. Everything. All right, across the board. In fact, the molestations are ridiculous. We won't even ask him questions about it. And he had lots of opportunities. He was there for 10 days to lie. And he testified that he knew about Mr. Walker. He said, I know there's someone who's going to come in here and say he was at our house that morning. He knows, we know, we get reports. They're not allowed to hide stuff. And so when Mr. Walker volunteers, we find out about it shortly thereafter, months before Erik Menendez ever took the witness stand. And how hard would it be to say, we went and we bought ammunition, and then we went back home and we played tennis, and then we left on a boat trip. But remember, Mr. Walker says he's there at 2 o'clock. And he's there for 45 minutes. And they're supposed to leave on the boat trip, according to Mr. Anderson even, at 3 o'clock. And yet no one is making any effort to prepare for this trip. Everyone's just sitting around letting the kids cuss at them. That's what's going on. And Erik knows this testimony is coming, and he could easily reconfigure his story if that's what he was going to do. And he didn't. And he also knows, obviously, that Mark Heffernan is going to say that he believes, although he has no schedule to prove it, that he gave him a tennis lesson on Friday rather than Thursday. But Erik remembers what Erik remembers, and that's what he testified to. And
I'm going to stop it here, and we'll pick up next time right where we left off, and it will be the final portion of these closing arguments, and then we will also we'll have them read the verdict and go through some of that too as well. So we'll kind of do a wrap up as well. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Please tune in next Tuesday. I always say the wrong date, so this one's airing Thursday. So tune in next Tuesday for the final part of Erik's closing and the verdict. We're gonna reveal the verdict as well, which, as we know, is a mistrial. So spoiler alert there, but we can read through it. All right, so thank you guys so much for watching. Please hit the like button on your way out if you don't mind, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye now.